Have you ever truly questioned history, not the names, dates, or textbook timelines, but the very foundation of what we're told to believe? Is the official record really a faithful mirror of the past, or is it a carefully constructed narrative? A tapestry woven from ambition, silence, and fear. How many volumes of forgotten wisdom were incinerated to preserve the pride of conquerors? How many ancient maps, statues, and forbidden texts were made to disappear not because they were false, but because they asked the wrong questions? What if the past we think we know is only the version that survived the fire? This is not a story built on fantasy or conspiracy. This is a confrontation with reality, a journey into undeniable erasure. Moments in time when truth was edited, when memory itself was reshaped to serve a greater authority. There's a paradox few dare to acknowledge. History is not just what happened. It is what was permitted to be remembered. Since the dawn of civilization, power has always claimed the right to define memory. Emperors, dynasties, churches, and empires didn't simply record their triumphs, they curated them. They celebrated victories with towering monuments while torching the libraries of their rivals. Names were scraped from stone tablets. Genealogies were rewritten. Annihilation wasn't only physical, it was narrative. The past wasn't just conquered, it was cleansed. When civilizations fall, people remember crumbling walls, shattered temples, and burnt cities. But what vanishes first quietly and irrevocably is memory. A single destroyed manuscript can erase entire chapters of knowledge. A falsified date can sever the legacy of a civilization. A forbidden idea labeled heresy becomes a ghost spoken only in whispers, if at all. Some erasures are loud. The fire that consumed the Library of Alexandria, or the classified vaults buried beneath the Vatican. Others are silent. A suppressed research paper, an ancient map dismissed as fantasy, and an archaeological site quietly omitted from the curriculum. And each time this happens, the arc of history bends ever so slightly away from truth and toward control. We're raised to believe that history is linear, objective, and absolute. But in truth, it is fragmented, contested, and filled with shadows. What should terrify us most isn't what's been destroyed, but what has been forgotten. Because once enough time passes, the keepers of history no longer need to burn books. They need only wait until no one remembers they ever existed. So, ask yourself, who holds the pen that writes the official chronicle of humanity? Who decides which memories endure and which are buried? Once you open that door, you may never look at the past the same way again. Take the Library of Alexandria. For many, it represents the pinnacle of ancient intellectual achievement, sanctuary of scrolls and knowledge, a beacon that once housed the wisdom of the known world. Astronomy, medicine, geometry, languages, philosophy, and myths from lands both near and remote preserved on over 700,000 scrolls, according to some estimates. But what haunts us isn't only what was stored, it's how and why it disappeared. Its destruction, far from being a single event, was a slow, repeated violence. The first blow came in 48 BCE, during Julius Caesar's siege of Alexandria, when fire from the harbor leapt into the storehouses, engulfing tens of thousands of texts. Later came Emperor Aurelian's brutal invasion, followed by the Christian purges under Theophilus, and then the Arab conquest. With each wave, more of the library's soul was stripped away until only silence remained. But modern scholars are beginning to see patterns, suggesting this was more than collateral damage. The burning may not have been an accident of war. It may have been a deliberate act of intellectual cleansing. The scrolls that lived there weren't just records of ancient science or literature. They carried competing cosmologies, philosophies that challenged divine authority, and histories that questioned the emerging order. They posed dangerous questions about origin, power, and the nature of truth. Why were there so many works in Alexandria about civilizations that had no part in the Greek or Roman world? Few about Persia, Assyria, Nubia, and even lost lands beyond the Mediterranean. And why did they all vanish together? In the centuries that followed, dominant religious authorities viewed these teachings as threats, remnants of paganism that had to be erased. Some surviving letters from philosophers and Roman scholars whisper of scrolls smuggled out before the fires, hidden away in secret places. Others suggest that the most subversive works were targeted first, those that contradicted the rising orthodoxies of empire and faith. Once the most dangerous knowledge had been destroyed, the rest was allowed to burn like evidence wiped clean. Think of Thelebre not as a building, but as a mirror, one that reflected a world too vast, too complex, and too free for the ruling order to endure. Inside were creation myths that didn't place humans at the center, maps that charted forgotten continents, records of civilizations that prospered without conquest or divine right. If even a fraction of that had survived, our understanding of history and ourselves might have been transformed. Instead, what remains are fragments, passing references, letters of lament, cracked mosaics of memory, and still the debate smolders. Was it a tragic accident of history, a fire born in chaos? Or was it the deliberate cleansing of memory, a surgical strike on collective knowledge, executed in the name of order? That question lingers, unresolved, and perhaps it always will. Because once history is rewritten, the truth doesn't vanish, hides waiting, and what it leaves behind is more than just an absence of manuscripts. It is a collapse of faith, the belief that knowledge, if precious enough, will somehow survive unless someone wants it destroyed. After the haunting legacy of Alexandria, few realize that, during the same era, another beacon of wisdom rose in a distant corner of the Hellenistic world, the Library of Pergamon. Perched high on the Acropolis of Anatolia, Pergamon was more than just the capital of a rising kingdom. It was a thriving cultural powerhouse, where the pursuit of knowledge became almost obsessive. At its peak, the Library of Pergamon housed over 200,000 scrolls, making it the second largest repository of learning in the ancient world, rivaled only by Alexandria itself. According to Pliny the Elder, the kings of the Attalid dynasty sent emissaries far and wide to Greece, Egypt, and Asia Minor, competing fiercely for every fragment of wisdom they could purchase or copy. Knowledge, for them, was no passive virtue. It was treasure, more valuable than gold, more enduring than conquest. But with ambition came rivalry. The Library of Pergamon soon found itself entangled in what modern scholars call the Library Wars. According to the geographer Strabo, the Ptolemies of Egypt, in a bid to stifle Pergamon's rise, banned the export of papyrus to the city, effectively attempting to starve its scribes. Yet Pergamon responded with ingenuity. In the absence of papyrus, its scholars developed a revolutionary material, pergamene, or parchment, crafted from treated animal skins. It was a direct rebuke, and it turned adversity into innovation. Far from a mere academic contest, this battle was one of soft power. Whoever possessed the greatest collection of texts shaped the intellectual soul of the ancient world. But Pergamon's ascent could not escape the shadow of Roman ambition. In 133 BCE, With the death of King Attalus III, the kingdom was willed to Rome. The annexation loomed, and just before Rome claimed the city, something extraordinary happened, something few could explain. A great number of Pergamon's most valuable scrolls vanished, according to fragmented accounts by Plutarch and others. Many of these manuscripts were either quietly smuggled out or deliberately destroyed before the transition. One theory suggests a preemptive Persian act of intellectual defiance to prevent Rome from inheriting the city's cultural crown. Others propose that Roman officials themselves orchestrated the removal, redistributing the scrolls to Rome and Alexandria, both now under imperial control, in a bid to centralize knowledge under a single authority. Whatever the case, the outcome was irreversible. Pergamon's scholarly legacy was gutted. Entire catalogues disappeared. Philosophical treatises, medical texts, scientific theories, and historical records were either absorbed, censored, or lost. What was once a living repository of thought became a skeleton of stone chambers, called mute witnesses to a silencing that would never be fully explained. A modern historian once observed, if Alexandria was a treasure turned to ash, Pergamon was a treasure dismantled layer by layer until only silence remained. And in that silence lies the real tragedy. Because once stripped of context, the future can no longer tell whether something faded by time or was deliberately erased to control the story. If these theories are true, the purging of Pergamon scrolls may have been a calculated attempt to sever future generations from truths deemed too dangerous, truths that could have challenged the myths Rome needed to canonize its dominance. Pergamon is not just an isolated example. It serves as a sobering reminder that humanity's memory is far more fragile than we dare to admit. Sometimes, true power doesn't come from what you know. It comes from controlling who gets to know it. And as the light of Greco-Roman knowledge flickered in Pergamon and Alexandria, our focus shifted eastward to yet another monumental archive of wisdom, the early Buddhist manuscripts of ancient India. Beginning in the 3rd century BCE, during the reign of Emperor Ashoka and the height of the Mauryan Empire, Buddhist teachings were meticulously compiled and dispersed across the subcontinent, hand-copied onto palm leaves, birch bark, and stone. These texts formed the backbone of a spiritual and philosophical renaissance. Major monastic centers like Nalanda, Vikramashala, and Odantapuri served not just as temples, but as vast educational institutions, custodians of what many believe to be the most unaltered transmission of the Buddha's earliest teachings. For centuries, these archives thrived, safeguarding sutras, moral discourses, cosmological texts, and scholarly commentaries. But today, most of these manuscripts are gone, and scholars are nearly unanimous. This loss was not the result of time or natural decay alone. In the 12th century, a wave of violent upheavals swept through India as Turkish and Afghan forces invaded the region. These were not just military conquests, they were ideological offensives. Monasteries were burned, libraries were looted or destroyed. Monks were either killed or fled into the mountains. In the 13th century, the Persian historian Minhagi Siraj described the fall of Nalanda as a methodical obliteration of Buddhist knowledge. He wrote that the fires consuming its library burned for 3 months, with the scent of scorched scripture drifting for miles. But perhaps the greatest mystery is what was not destroyed, because there's no definitive record of what monks managed to rescue before the flames. Some oral traditions speak of monastic scholars fleeing east, carrying sacred manuscripts into Nepal, Bhutan, and Tibet. Others suggest the scrolls were hidden in remote Himalayan caves, preserved in secret, until the time was right for their return. But no concrete evidence has yet surfaced. What survives today are mostly later translations, some in Chinese, others in Tibetan, filtered through centuries of interpretation, redaction, and doctrinal shifts, which raises a haunting dilemma. What remains of the original Dharma? What has been faithfully preserved, and what has been reshaped intentionally or not by competing agendas? Some historians suggest that this intellectual loss was not only caused by foreign invasions, but also by internal rivalries among Buddhist schools and changing political patronage. As dynasties shifted, so too did the favored interpretations of Buddhist doctrine. In time, original texts were sidelined in favor of more ideologically convenient versions. The great libraries of India didn't just fall to swords, they fractured from within, under the weight of forgotten loyalties and the silent war for narrative control. What connects Nalanda to Pergamon and Pergamon to Alexandria is not geography. It is no religion nor culture. It is the uncomfortable truth that knowledge has always lived under threat, just from fire and conquest, but from those who fear its power. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world is not a weapon or an army, it's an idea. And those who ruled the present have always known to rule the future. One must first erase the past. Every dynasty had its reasons for preserving certain texts and quietly discarding others. Manuscripts that challenged authority, questioned orthodoxy, or offered alternate philosophical visions were often deemed too dangerous to survive. They were not burned in the streets or shredded by mobs. Instead, they were simply excluded from the grand copying projects that preserved Buddhist teachings across empires, silently left behind in forgotten corners of monastery shelves until mold, time, and silence completed the work of censorship. For centuries, the transmission of Buddhism was not a neutral act. It was shaped by the converging powers of religion, political ideology, and academic control. No one can say with certainty how much was lost, how many original ideas, early schools, or critical texts vanished quietly in the name of uniformity. Their disappearance leaves behind a deep and haunting void in our understanding of early Buddhist thought. Had those manuscripts survived, we might perceive a richer, more complex vision of Buddhism, one more closely intertwined with pervadic Indian philosophy, or one that preserved the diversity of early sects before imperial systems narrowed the canon. Instead, what remains are ruins, the stone foundations of ancient libraries at Nanda and Vikramashala, weathered bookshelf pedestals, and empty sanctuaries where once the voices of many schools echoed. But the most vital parts, the pages, the insights, the subtle distinctions are gone, and their absence doesn't suggest simple neglect. It feels deliberate. A slow, strategic erasure carried out so gently and thoroughly that no one can even name the hand that began it. Like the Library of Alexandria or Pergamon before it, the story of India's vanished Buddhist manuscripts is not just one of is a warning, a reminder that the history of ideas is never safe from the reach of power. And in the end, one question remains: were those scriptures truly reduced to ash? Or are they still out there sleeping in some hidden mountain hollow, waiting for a world finally ready to remember itself? If Alexandria, Pergamon, and the Buddhist monasteries were victims of war, neglect, or covert campaigns to dominate knowledge, then ancient China presents something even more chilling: a state-sponsored, openly declared, and meticulously documented purge of collective memory. The infamous burning of books and burying of scholars under Emperor Qin Shi Huang wasn't symbolic. It was, in both scope and intention, one of the most calculated efforts to erase intellectual diversity in recorded history. According to Shi, the records of the Grand Historian compiled by Sima Qian, the edict was issued in 213 BCE, just after the Qin dynasty unified the warring states into a single empire. The official justification was to unify thought to match the newly unified state. But beneath that surface lay a deeper motive, the elimination of dissent and of historical memory that could undermine the emperor's divine right to rule. It began with the Council of Prime Minister Li Si, a fierce advocate of legalissima doctrine that rejected debate and upheld obedience through law. He warned that Confucian scholars and rival schools were still transmitting dangerous ideas, histories, rituals, and philosophies from the previous kingdoms that could stir unrest or nostalgia. The emperor agreed. The order was clear, with few exceptions. Books on agriculture, medicine, divination, and technical crafts, all texts from the preaching world, were to be surrendered for destruction. Poetry, philosophy, literature, and records of earlier dynasties were collected en masse. Those caught hiding them faced exile, forced labor, or death. Within months, the capital of Shanyang became the stage for a public reckoning. Vast mounds of bamboo scrolls and parchment were burned in towering bonfires at the imperial court. But in those flames, it wasn't just ink and wood that turned to smoke. It was the spiritual and intellectual heritage of a civilization. Works on virtue, music, morality, government, and cosmic order vanished into the air, their embers lighting up the horizon. And the violence did not end with books. A year later, Qin Shi Huang ordered the live burial of hundreds of Confucian scholars executed not for treason or rebellion, but for thought. Their crime was memory. Their sentence was silence. Some accounts, written during the succeeding Han dynasty, may have exaggerated the purge, perhaps to cast the Qin as tyrants and justify their own rise. Archaeological evidence shows that some texts survived, hidden in remote provinces or preserved by noble families who risked everything to keep them. Still, even if the full extent was dramatized, the core truth remains unshaken. The Qin regime openly declared that knowledge was a threat and thus must be controlled. This act was unlike anything before it. There was no excuse of war, no veil of divine protection. It was a naked admission that intellectual plurality was incompatible with absolute power. And it set a precedent that would echo through the centuries, that any regime that fears its past will try to erase it. The Qin dynasty, builders of the Great Wall and masters of logistics, engineering, and bureaucracy, also became the architects of one of the world's earliest memory purges. And in doing so, they sowed the seeds of their own collapse. For no order, however grand, can remain stable when built upon forced amnesia. Today, as archaeologists unearth bamboo strips and sift through the remains of buried libraries, new questions rise with the dust. How many texts disappeared before they could be copied? What knowledge of governance, ethics, astronomy, and cosmology was lost in that single purge? And more profoundly, did those flames succeed in silencing thought, or did they only sharpen the hunger in generations that followed? The burning of the books under Qin Shi Huang stands as one of history's most chilling warnings. When power reaches its apex, it no longer seeks to rule territory. It seeks to rule memory. It seeks to control the very vocabulary of truth. And from the ashes of those lost texts, one question still flickers, undying. What else remains, buried beneath stone, beneath sand, beneath silence waiting to remind us who we really were? Amid the towering stone pyramids of the Maya civilization lies a forgotten tragedy, one not of war or disease, but of knowledge reduced to ash. Few today realize that Mesoamerica once housed a vast literary tradition. Thousands of intricate manuscripts or codices, meticulously crafted from bark paper, coated with white lime, and inscribed with one of the most complex hieroglyphic systems in the ancient world. These codices were far more than religious scriptures. They contained astronomical charts, mathematical theories, calendrical systems, dynastic records, and ceremonial wisdom, centuries of intellectual achievement pressed into delicate folds of bark. And yet, we now understand only fragments of what was lost when Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Yucatan Peninsula in the early 16th century. The fate of this sophisticated body of knowledge was sealed. In the name of Christian evangelism and colonial domination, Spanish clergy labeled Maya manuscripts as satanic works of demonic origin. The most infamous act of destruction came in 1562, when Bishop Diego de Landa ordered a mass book burning in the town of Mani. In his own account, Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán, he describes collecting every codex he could find and setting them alight in public, convinced they were lies authored by the devil. Ancient wisdom, carefully preserved by generations of Maya scribes and elders, was obliterated in a matter of hours. And those who held the knowledge were not spared. Many were tortured, forced to reveal rituals and traditions considered dangerous to the colonial order. The cruel irony is this: Diego de Landa, the man responsible for annihilating most of the Maya written legacy, also left behind the most detailed record of their writing system, a paradox that has haunted scholars for generations. It wasn't until the 20th century that researchers began to decode the Maya script using his biased but invaluable notes. But without the original codices, the task has been like trying to reconstruct an entire civilization from shattered glass. Out of what was once a literary sea, only 4 codices are known to have survived: the Dresden Codex, the Madrid Codex, the Paris Codex, and the Grolier Codex. All 4 are now held in European institutions, painful symbols that the intellectual heritage of the Maya no longer belongs to their descendants. Some modern historians argue this was not merely religious, but a calculated act of cultural erasure. By destroying manuscripts, colonizers stripped indigenous populations of their ancestral memory, obliterating records of history, land ownership, and spiritual identity. Knowledge was not just a casualty of conquest, it was a weapon. And the burning of books was not only symbolic, it was strategic. Controlled the past, and you shaped the future. In the colonial imagination, a people without history are easier to rule. Today, when we walk through the ruins of Palenque, Copan, or Tikal, we are left to imagine what those flames consumed. Advanced astronomical charts, dynastic epics, formulas for eclipse prediction, and detailed agriculturalites are now gone. Every codex destroyed was a chapter of human understanding lost forever, each one a piece of an unfinished puzzle. And yet, the final irony remains. To reconstruct Maya history, scholars have had to rely on the writings of the very man who ordered its destruction. Diego de Landa's glyph, inventory flawed and filtered through religious contempt, is still the key that opened the door to deciphering this lost world. But no matter how much we recover, the burned pages will never return. And no one can say how many secrets remain buried in the ashes, unreachable, silent. This story leaves us with a chilling question. Was the fire at Mani simply the tragic result of a clash of civilizations and belief systems? Or was it part of a deliberate strategy to ensure that Maya knowledge could never again challenge colonial narratives or reclaim its voice? And if those flames had never been lit, would the pre-Columbian history of the Americas be told with greater clarity, dignity, and truth? After the devastation of the Maya codices, the trail of erased knowledge leads us back across the ocean to a sacred text once embraced by early Jewish and Christian communities, then abruptly erased from Scripture. This is the story of the Book of Enoch manuscript, both profoundly revered and violently suppressed. According to ancient tradition, Enoch was the seventh patriarch after Adam, a man who walked with God and was taken to heaven without tasting death. But what makes the Book of Enoch so powerful and so controversial is not just its mythic voice. It's the radical cosmology it proposes and the deep theological challenges it poses to the established religious order, also known as 1 Enoch or the Book of Enoch. The text is divided into several distinct sections, the most famous being the Book of the Watchers and the Book of the Luminaries. These writings tell of a group of angels, the Watchers, sent to Earth to observe humanity. They fall into temptation, teaching humans forbidden arts, metallurgy, astronomy, magic, and arcane rituals. Their rebellion leads to an age of chaos, violence, and ultimately, a great cleansing flood. The questions raised by Enoch are profound and deeply unsettling. If God's authority is singular and sovereign, how could rogue angels act independently? If divine knowledge was a gift, why was humanity punished for receiving it? Where does wisdom end and sin begin? In the early centuries of the Common Era, the Book of Enoch was widely read among early Christian communities and embraced by the Essenes at Qumran. Portions were even echoed in the New Testament. Jude 1:14 quotes Enoch directly, a sign of its initial legitimacy. But as church doctrine crystallized, Enoch became an uncomfortable outlier. By the 4th century, during the councils of Nicaea and Laodicea, the Book of Enoch was officially excluded from the biblical canon. Labeled apocryphal and dangerous, it was banned from circulation. In the Greek and Latin churches, it faded into near total obscurity. Only in Ethiopia did it survive. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church preserved 1 Enoch in its entirety, in the ancient Ge'ez language making it the only branch of Christianity to retain this ancient cosmic text as part of its official scriptures. To the rest of Christendom, however, Enoch became a ghoster, forbidden book whispered about in shadows, remembered in fragments, and buried under theological suspicion. For over 1,500 years, European scholars had no access to it. It was as if the book had vanished, and in a way it had deliberately. For centuries, the Book of Enoch lingered in the shadows of religious history, its name whispered in footnotes, its influence hinted at in apocryphal references. It wasn't until the 18th century that the modern world encountered it again. When Scottish explorer James Bruce returned from Ethiopia carrying several handwritten copies, the academic world was stunned. For the first time, scholars could study a full version of a text long buried in silence. What they found was unlike anything in the official canon: elaborate cosmologies, numerological mysticism, and vivid portrayals of supernatural beings, angels, and watchers who defied divine order. But the question emerged: why had this text been excluded in the first place? The suppression of the Book of Enoch was not a mere oversight. Many scholars now argue that its disappearance was a strategic move, part of a larger effort to consolidate theological power. At a time when the Church was crafting a unified doctrine, a text like Enoch posed a serious problem. It introduced spiritual forces that operated independently of divine command. It suggested that knowledge could be passed to humankind through forbidden channels outside God's will, outside the Church's sacraments. If true, the Church's exclusive claim to salvation and spiritual authority would fracture. In that context, Enoch had to disappear, not because it was heretical in the vulgar sense, but because it opened doors that threatened the very architecture of religious control. And yet, when we study the surviving text today, we hear of Babylonian star law, Egyptian afterlife beliefs, and the mystical traditions of pre-Judaic culture. The Book of Enoch appears not as an anomaly, but as a bridge, a rare, fragile thread linking the wisdom traditions of the ancient world. And this raises unsettling questions. How many versions of Enoch once existed? Did earlier variants contain even more radical ideas about the nature of evil, divine rebellion, or humanity's role in the cosmos? Most importantly, if Enoch had not been buried, if it had remained part of the mainstream tradition, would our understanding of religious history be fundamentally different? The long silence surrounding it is proof of something profound. Not all knowledge is lost in fire. Some truths are buried in darkness, hidden by those who claim the right to define reality. And in the end, we are left with an echo that refuses to fade. How many other pages of human insight were quietly erased so that faith could be made manageable, linear, and easier to control? If the disappearance of Enoch is the story of wisdom, smothered in silence, the tale of the Gnostic texts is one of direct confrontation, a fierce and deliberate war on alternative spiritual knowledge. It was not hidden, it was hunted. Gnosticism flourished in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE across Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor. Gnostic communities offered radically different interpretations of the divine, the cosmos, and the purpose of human life. They claimed that the material world was not the flawless creation of a benevolent God, but the flawed construct of a lesser being, the demiurge. To them, the soul was a divine spark trapped in flesh, seeking liberation through Narcissa deep, inner knowledge, inaccessible through institutional rituals. These teachings struck at the very heart of emerging Christian orthodoxy. If salvation could be found within, without priesthood, without sacraments, without Rome, then the foundation of the institutional church was at risk. Gnostic texts were copied in secret. Communities preserved them on papyrus scrolls. Mystical dialogues, revelations, and alternative gospels, many attributed to Jesus, but given only to those who could grasp their hidden meanings. Among them are the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Apocalypse of Adam, the Gospel of Truth, and dozens more. The Gospel of Thomas in particular stunned theologians centuries later for declaring, "The kingdom of God is within you, no mediator required." By the late 2nd century, early church leaders like Irenaeus launched a systematic campaign to eradicate these texts. The Gnostics were accused of heresy, forgery, and spiritual deception. Possession of their writings became a crime. Manuscripts were seized, burned, and buried. Those who copied or circulated them faced excommunication, death. So effective was the purge that, for over 1,000 years, Gnostic thought survived only through the polemics of its enemies. Its memory became a caricature, a threat painted in the darkest colors. Until 1945, in the hills near Nag Hammadi, Egypt, an unsuspecting farmer broke open a sealed clay jar buried beneath the earth and, changed the study of early Christianity forever. Inside were 13 papyrus codices, containing over 50 lost Gnostic texts, almost entirely intact. The Nag Hammadi library. Translated and studied, they revealed a spiritual world unlike any described in canonical scripture. A cosmos of luminous realms, divine emanations, and imprisoned souls where earthly institutions, including religious ones, were seen not as saviors but as chains. These texts showed that early Christianity was never monolithic. It was a storm of ideas, a battle of interpretations, one of which simply outlasted the others. Scholars caution against painting the Gnostics as pure or universally virtuous. Some communities were elitist, claiming to guard truth for the few. But what cannot be denied is this: for over 1,000 years, copying a Gnostic text was an act of defiance against religious power, a whisper against a wall of silence. Today, as we read them in modern languages, another question rises: had these texts survived in public view, would Christianity look like it does now? Would its story be a linear thread or a symphony of competing truths? And even deeper, what does it say about spiritual authority that it must be protected not only by preaching, but also by burning books and erasing memory? The suppression of the Gnostics was not just about protecting the faith, it was about protecting the gate that stood between human beings and their own inner light. And if memory can rise again from a forgotten clay jar, how many more fragments lie buried waiting to remind us of all we were never allowed to know? If Enoch and the Gnostics reveal the forceful suppression of religious alternatives, then Babylon offers a different kind of mystery, one steeped in silence. No proclamations, no crusades, just absence, and the quiet void that follows when centuries of brilliance vanish without trace. Babylon once the radiant city of the Euphrates was, the intellectual jewel of Mesopotamia. Its libraries preserved thousands of clay tablets etched in cuneiform, astronomical calculations that rivaled modern precision, complex legal codes, surgical manuals, philosophical poems, and mythologies that shaped the ancient Near East. Was, by every measure, a civilization obsessed with knowledge. And yet today, only fragments remain. Where did it all go? Unlike the Library of Alexandria or Chinchina's book burning, there is no single moment, no decisive purge to explain Babylon. Cultural erasure. Instead, there is silence in eerie and total absence, as though the city's memory was slowly pulled into the sands by invisible hands. And centuries later, those who ask why are met not with answers, but with more silence. Many of these ancient sites remain unexcavated or, if they have been explored, no verified findings have ever been made public. Among archaeologists, there's a quiet consensus. This subject is too politically and theologically volatile to pursue openly. The reason isn't merely funding or institutional inertia, it's the deeper threat. Such discoveries pose to the foundational narratives of one of the most fiercely contested regions on Earth, and so, the story of the Copper Scroll becomes yet another emblem of how knowledge can be suppressed not through fire or official censorship, but through a quiet, coordinated silence. A silence maintained by those with the most to lose if the full truth were ever brought into the light. And again, we find ourselves facing the same question. Will a forgotten fragment of the ancient world one day emerge to pierce the fog of legend, or will the truth remain entombed beneath the thick dust of sealed archives and institutional gatekeeping? From the mystery of the Copper Scroll and its untouched treasure sites near the Dead Sea, we are led into another controversial chapter 1 that stretches across oceans, buried not beneath desert sands, but across the grassy plains of North America. This is the tale of giant human skeletons, allegedly unearthed across the United States throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, only to vanish without a trace between the 1840s and 1930s. A flood of reports emerged from local newspapers, early archaeological journals, and regional bulletins. They told of massive skeletons between 8 and 10 feet tall, discovered inside ancient burial mounds. These remains were often accompanied by stone tools, ornate jewelry, and evidence of a long-lost culture. Major publications like the New York Times, Scientific American, and the Nevada Tribune carried these headlines. In 1877, a reporter from Eureka, Nevada, claimed the discovery of a massive skeleton inside a stone-lined tomb. In 1891, at the Cahokia Mounds of Illinois, similar bones were said to have been recovered. From the Ohio River Valley to the mound fields of Indiana, the pattern continued, painting a picture of a lost race of giants unknown to modern anthropology. What gives this mystery further weight and controversies? The recurring appearance of one institution in these stories, the Smithsonian. According to numerous historical accounts, agents from the Smithsonian were often dispatched to collect these remains for study and preservation. But while the public headlines told of discovery, what followed was silence. None of these skeletons ever appeared in Smithsonian exhibits. No formal academic papers, no public records. Over time, the trail went cold. The bones were never seen, again surviving only in fragile newspaper clippings and the spoken memories of aging communities. This vanishing act ignited generations of speculation. Many researchers, both independent and professional, have accused the Smithsonian and other government-funded institutions of actively suppressing these finds. The charge is that they deliberately destroyed or concealed the skeletons because their existence threatened the reigning theories of human history. Evolutionary anthropology, still solidifying its foundations in the early 20th century, could not easily account for an advanced or genetically divergent race of prehistoric giants in North America. In 2014, a viral article claimed that the Smithsonian had been legally compelled to admit to the destruction of thousands of giant skeletons in the early 1900s. The Smithsonian quickly issued a firm denial, labeling the report a hoax and asserting that no such skeletons ever existed in their records. Yet critics argue that denials are not disproofs. They point to the sprawling, underfunded archives of major museums where artifacts often lie unacknowledged, unexamined, and unacknowledged. Historians remind us that the late 19th century was an ideological battleground. The rise of Darwinian theory and rationalist anthropology coincided with aggressive efforts to redefine the story of human origins. Discoveries that didn't fit bones, anomalous artifacts, oral histories that spoke of non-human rulers were either ignored, discredited, or conveniently lost. As a result, the legend of the lost giants has become more than folklore. It is now a symbol of the grey, uncomfortable space between fact and fiction, where institutions wield enormous control over what becomes official history. Among Native American tribes like the Show, the Iroquois, and the Paiute, stories of red-haired, powerful, and ultimately defeated have echoed for generations. When the reported discoveries of large skeletons occur in the very places these legends describe, the line between oral tradition and historical reality becomes blurry and harder to dismiss. To this day, the grassy mounds of the Midwest remain. Some have been excavated, many have not. Local museums occasionally display oversized tools, thick femur fragments, and strange ornaments, but no intact skeleton has ever been verified by modern, independent review. No public database confirms their existence. And like the silence around the copper scroll, this absence only deepens the suspicion. Was it incompetence, archival disorganization, or was it something more deliberate, a quiet policy of omission, designed to keep human history neat, linear, and free of anomalies? In the shadows of these questions, the untouched mounds stand like ancient tombstones without names, silent, watchful, and defiant. They challenge us not only to dig deeper, but also to ask whether we are truly prepared for what lies beneath the soil. And this brings us to a wider and even more troubling trend: the systematic disappearance of excavation reports themselves. During the formative years of modern archaeology, from the 1870s through the 1930s, Western nations launched thousands of expeditions across the ancient world. The British Museum, the Louvre, German antiquities societies, and American institutions, like the Aya, flooded regions from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, producing vast archives, hand-drawn maps, excavation journals, thousands of photographs, and artifact logs. Initially, these documents were stored in national libraries and shared with universities and independent researchers. But something shifted in the decades after World War II. A growing number of these records were quietly pulled from circulation. Some were labeled in review, others marked for reorganization. A few were simply erased from catalogues altogether. One especially telling case involves British expeditions to Iraq between 1920 and 1935. Their teams excavated layers of ruins in Nineveh, Nimrod, and Kishi sites rich with Sumerian, Assyrian, and Pre-Akkadian artifacts. According to private correspondences, some finds did not match expected timelines. Tablets containing strange inscriptions, objects made with unexplained metallurgical techniques. Even T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, once remarked in a personal note that certain tablets were unpublishable, not for their content, but for their implication. By the 1950s, many of those expedition reports had disappeared from the British Museum's official catalogue. Their contents, never digitized, never reissued, have since been replaced by summaries, condensed versions, sanitized narratives. In the United States, a similar pattern emerges. The American Institute of Archaeology's early reports on the Cahokia and Etowah mounds once described massive ceremonial platforms, unusual skeletal features, and high-quality metallurgy unknown among tribal cultures of the era. Yet, by the 1930s, those records were quietly recalled. The official explanation was the correction of errors, but the corrected versions never appeared. Independent historians who attempted to gain access to original documents were met with a familiar refrain: the files were either no longer extant or temporarily unavailable. In France, the École Française d'Extrême-Orient had once archived thousands of fragile glass negatives and handwritten notes from early 20th century expeditions across Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos. Some of these records captured lost inscriptions, unusual symbols, and anomalous dates, materials that could have compelled a radical re-examination of the historical timeline of Angkor and neighboring civilizations. But by the 1970s, many of these archival boxes were sealed, with authorities citing the chaos of the Indochina Wars and the imperative to preserve delicate materials. Decades later, nearly half a century on, only a small fraction of these materials has ever been declassified. The rest, their whereabouts are unknown. No digital trail, no formal record of transfer, no public announcement of destruction. Just absence. These vanishing records lead to a deeper and more unsettling question. Why do excavation reports, allegedly neutral, scientific documents disappear so quietly and so completely from public access? Is it merely bureaucratic disarray, as some suggest? Or is there a more calculated reason? Could it be that data that undermines accepted models of history is being deliberately withdrawn to preserve consensus? Some scholars maintain a cautious tone, attributing these gaps to mismanagement, underfunded archives, or logistical oversight. But those who have personally filed access requests only to receive the same templated denials, citing political sensitivity, pending verification, or awaiting expert review, find such explanations increasingly unconvincing. Behind those locked archive doors may lie nothing more than mundane scribbles and duplicate notes. Or they may hold evidence potent enough to challenge the dominant narrative of humanity's ancient evolution. Either way, the fact remains: when access to historical data is restricted to a privileged few, the public is left with a sanitized version of the past, clean, cohesive, and easy to digest. The disappearance of these reports never made headlines. There was no gold, no treasure, no crumbling temple, ruins, only silence. A growing, deliberate silence that swallows the past and leaves behind a vacuum. But that silence demands one final question. How many times in modern history have original documents been hidden away? Not for reasons of preservation or authentication, simply to prevent a new generation from encountering a version of truth deemed too inconvenient. From lost excavation reports, we journey now to a place so iconic it risks being taken for granted: the Giza Plateau in Egypt. For centuries, the three Great Pyramids have loomed as symbols of eternal knowledge and vanished glory, drawing archaeologists, mystics, and tourists alike. Each visitor arrives hoping to glimpse some fragment of the mystery, but those fragments are often controlled, curated, and incomplete. Beneath the luminous limestone facade of the Great Pyramid of Khufu, also known as Cheops, lies an underground world largely hidden from the public eye, a labyrinth of narrow shafts, steep vertical pits, and forgotten chambers. The most enigmatic of these is known simply as the subterranean chamber. It rests beneath the very base of the pyramid, more than 30 meters below the desert floor. As far back as the 19th century, explorers like Flinders, Petrie, and Giovanni Caviglia had studied this space in remarkable detail. They described a roughly hewn room, unfinished corridors stretching into darkness, and a central shaft that seemed to descend into a void with no discernible bottom. Petrie speculated that the chamber may have had a ritual purpose, or perhaps represented a construction that was never completed. For decades, researchers and even a few daring adventurers were allowed to descend into these depths, taking photographs, collecting measurements, and publishing field reports. But all that changed in the late 1990s. Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, under the leadership of Zahi Hawass, abruptly restricted access to the lower chambers of the pyramid. The reason given: structural safety and preservation. But oddly, while the deepest chambers were closed to researchers, the upper galleries and King's Chamber remained open to tourists so long as they had purchased a ticket. This selective closure immediately sparked suspicion among independent scholars and investigative writers. Figures such as Graham Hancock and Andrew Collins pointed to radar data and ground-penetrating surveys suggesting the existence of hidden voids beneath the known subterranean areas. They referred to preliminary results from the Scam Pyramids project, which used cutting-edge Morn tomography to peer into the Great Pyramid without drilling. These scans uncovered previously undetected cavities, including one substantial void absent from traditional architectural blueprints. Egypt's Ministry of Antiquities swiftly denied any cover-up, insisting that no major discoveries had been made and that all research was carried out in the interest of heritage conservation. But the strict control of information, the delays in permit approvals, and the lack of transparency continued to fuel doubt. Was something truly being withheld? And if so, what? In ancient Egyptian cosmology, the pyramid was not merely a tomb. It was a cosmic machine, a spiritual vessel linking the physical world to the divine. Hellenistic sources referred to the underground spaces as the Hall of Trials, a sacred threshold where the soul passed through darkness before rebirth. If these underground rooms contained ceremonial architecture, lost texts, or early expressions of Egyptian theology, the implications could be immense. To this day, the only available images of the subterranean chamber are either faded black and white photographs from the early 20th century or grainy, unauthorized images taken before restrictions came into effect. The official response remains frozen in time. Further research is needed. But the very lack of disclosure, the vacuum of information, suggests that research has already occurred and that its results have been carefully curated or suppressed. Standing atop the sunlit stones of the Giza Plateau, surrounded by smartphone flashes and selfie sticks, it's easy to forget what may lie directly beneath your feet. Chambers no one has fully explored in modern times, at least not publicly. And the deeper question emerges: what lies hidden in the dark heart of the pyramid? A sacred archive, a forgotten sanctuary, or perhaps just silence, preserved in stone. But more pressing than any of these possibilities is a systemic concern. Why, for decades, has the decision to open or seal these ancient spaces rested in the hands of so few, while the rest of the world is left only to guess? From the sealed underworld of Giza, our search for buried truths now shifts far across the globe to the ethereal blue waters of Lake Titicaca, straddling the border between Bolivia and Peru, a place so steeped in myth and memory that it too has blurred the lines between archaeology and the sacred. Here, in the rarefied air of the Andes at over 3,800 meters above sea level, the lake is more than a body of water. It is the cradle of Andean civilization. According to Inca mythology, it was from this lake that the divine children of the sun first emerged, founders of empire, carriers of cosmic wisdom. And beneath these ancient waters, Spanish conquistadors once heard whispers, sunken cities, of submerged temples, of stone columns rising through the murk toward the surface. Whispers that have never quite faded. But it wasn't until the late 20th century that modern technology dared to probe the ancient legends surrounding Lake Titicaca. In the year 2000, a bold international archaeological initiative, jointly supported by the Bolivian government, the Andean Archaeological Research Institute, and several European cultural organizations, launched a comprehensive investigation. Utilizing deep-water, sonar scanning, and diving expeditions, the team explored the lake's southern depths. What they reported stunned the South American academic world. Beneath the lake's shimmering surface lay the unmistakable remnants of a vast, submerged architectural complex. Geometric stone walls, monolithic columns, stepped platforms, and foundations stretched across thousands of square meters. Among the ruins, divers recovered ritual artifacts, ceramic figurines, intricately carved objects, and symbols that seemed religious in nature. Initial interpretations suggested a possible ceremonial hub tied to the Tiwanaku civilization, which flourished between the 5th and 12th centuries CE. Yet not everything aligned. The style of masonry, the layout, and particularly the iconography diverged sharply from known Tiwanaku patterns. A quiet murmur began among more cautious scholars. Could these ruins belong to a civilization far older, one lost entirely to recorded history? Then, as momentum built and the international press prepared features, everything halted. Without warning, the excavation was suspended. Official statements cited funding shortfalls and the need for cultural sensitivity. Yet those closest to the project questioned these explanations. The original funding had already been secured for years. Local indigenous communities, rather than resisting, had expressed pride and enthusiasm for the discovery, offering full cooperation. More puzzling still was the blanket denial of access to the recovered materials. Even researchers directly involved in the initial phases were barred from further study. European sponsors quietly withdrew, and key documents related to the site maps, inventories, and dive logs disappeared from public circulation. No detailed sonar scans, no carbon dating results, and no complete artifact records have ever been released. Only a few carefully staged images and vague press statements remained, just enough to confirm that something was found, but not what it was or what it could mean. Independent scholars were left bewildered. If the site was truly insignificant or already well understood, why the sudden blackout? Some began to speculate that the ruins might contain evidence disruptive enough to challenge dominant timelines of Andean history, perhaps even pointing to forgotten transoceanic contact or a civilization unaccounted for in global prehistory. A more conservative view suggests internal disputes or geopolitical interference, but even that fails to explain the totality of the silence that followed. Today, tourists glide across Lake Titicaca, unaware of the mystery that lies beneath. The ruins remain untouched, the archives locked, the stone structures sleep in darkness, and the truth remains buried not by time but by decision. The real question may no longer be who built them, but who decided the world shouldn't know. From the silenced depths of Lake Titicaca, our journey now shifts to another high-altitude enigma buried deep in the remote Bayon Kariula mountain range along the China-Tibet border. Isolated, windswept, and treacherous, this range harbors one of the strangest archaeological mysteries of the 20th century, the story of the Dropa stones. According to scattered accounts published in the West beginning in the 1960s, the tale begins in the late 1930s with an expedition lead by Chinese archaeologist Chipu Tai. The team explored a network of limestone caves more than 3,000 meters above sea level inside. They reportedly found a series of tombs containing unusual skeletal remains, short spindly bodies with abnormally large skulls. But the real discovery was something else. Over 700 circular stone discs, each about 30 centimeters wide, 2 centimeters thick, with a central hole and etched spiral grooves. The grooves were not random. In 1962, Professor Sum Nui, allegedly affiliated with the Beijing Academy of Ancient Studies, began a meticulous analysis. He claimed that the spirals were in fact a form of microscopic writing, an ancient script unlike any known. His translation, if true, was astonishing. The discs told of a race of beings who had come from the stars, crash-landed in the mountains, and struggled to survive among the local population. Over time, they were said to have forged a fragile coexistence, even interbreeding with the native people. If authentic, the Dropa stones would represent one of the oldest written accounts of extraterrestrial contact, revelation that understandably sent shockwaves through both academic and fringe communities. But just as attention grew, the story vanished. Some Nui's work disappeared from official Chinese records. His name could not be verified in academic directories. The Beijing Academy denied any involvement. No peer-reviewed publication ever released his translations, and efforts by Western researchers to track the expedition's materials led to dead ends. No photographs of the tombs, no catalogue of the discs, no access to the artifacts, nothing. From that point on, the Dropa stones fell into a kind of historical purgatorious space between myth and suppressed reality. Skeptics labeled the whole story a fabrication, citing the absence of solid sources. But others noted something equally important: the lack of any definitive disproof. There was no official debunking, no international review, only an eerie and unbroken silence. Some reports claimed that a handful of the stones were once displayed briefly in a Chinese museum before being quietly removed. Today, no authenticated specimens are held in any public archive or institution. What lends the story a haunting plausibility is this: the technical description of the Dropa discs is not inconsistent with known Tibetan traditions of carving symbolic messages into stone. Local legends across the region have long told of sky people or star-born ancestors. Whether these myths inspired the Dropa Taylor were inspired by it remains unclear. Perhaps the Dropa stones were an elaborate hoax. Perhaps they were misunderstood artifacts folded into mythology. Or perhaps, as some suspect, they were evidence of something so far outside accepted historical narratives that the only response was quiet removal. One thing is certain: in both the Andes and the Himalayas, monumental discoveries surfaced only to be silenced, not by erosion or war, but by bureaucratic closure, political caution, or something else entirely. And as long as these chapters remain hidden, the story of human history remains incomplete, its most ancient echoes drowned in silence, waiting to be heard again. And yet, no one has ever offered a clear explanation for how hundreds of intricately carved stone discs, if they truly existed, could leave behind no verifiable photographs, no comprehensive academic studies, and no trace in institutional archives. Critics have labeled it one of the boldest archaeological hoaxes of the 20th century. But for those on the fringes of mainstream archaeology, the mystery lies not just in what's claimed, but in what's missing. It's the absence of denial, the disappearance of any credible documentation, and the uniform silence from Chinese authorities that cast a deeper shadow. The so-called Dropa stones remain locked in a strange paradox impossible to confirm, yet suspiciously difficult to disprove today. Few travelers passing through the silent Bayankara Mountains would ever suspect that this wind-scoured terrain was once the epicenter of an enduring debate, one that questioned the very boundary between legend and historical truth. As with many ancient enigmas, the power of the story is not fueled by evidence, but by an orchestrated absence, which raises the question, still echoing decades later: if the Dropa stones were an invention, why has no institution conclusively disproven them? But if they were aerial, what exactly was discovered on those discs that warranted their total erasure, as though the event had never happened? From this trail of vanished artifacts and institutional silence, we turn to a broader and equally provocative concept of parts or out-of-place artifacts. Coined in the mid-20th century by zoologist Ivan T. Sanderson, the term refers to ancient objects whose form, technology, or context seem far too advanced or simply illogical for the civilizations that supposedly produced them. These items aren't merely oddities, they are anomalies that threaten to upend accepted chronologies. But what makes UPARTs so sensitive is not simply their implications, it's the way they're handled. Across major institutions, many such artifacts have been temporarily acknowledged, even briefly exhibited, only to be later reclassified, locked away, or removed from public view entirely. They are often dismissed as items of uncertain provenance or quietly transferred to restricted archives. Among the most famous is the Antikythera mechanism discovered in 1901 from a Roman-era shipwreck off the coast of Greece. At first, scholars dismissed its intricate arrangement of bronze gears as either misdated or misunderstood. For decades, it sat in storage. Only after renewed analysis did researchers confirm the truth. It was a sophisticated astronomical calculator with mechanical precision comparable to 18th century clockwork. Today, it's proudly displayed in Athens' National Archaeological Museum. But for half a century, it was hidden in plain sight, deemed too advanced to fit the timeline of known Greek technology. Another compelling case is the Baghdad Battery, unearthed in 1936 near Taizen, Iraq. This ceramic vessel containing a copper cylinder showed traces of acidic residue. Some researchers proposed that it may have functioned as a primitive electrochemical cell possibly used for gold, because such a device didn't align with prevailing beliefs about technology during the Parthian era. The artifact languished in obscurity within the Baghdad Museum until its image appeared in a Western publication years later. Then there are the Klerksdorp spheres of South African metallic nodules with concentric grooves that appear to geometrically perfect to be natural. The so-called London hammer, mysteriously embedded in a prehistoric sandstone formation, or pre-Columbian sculptures from Central America that resemble modern flying machines. Each of these artifacts followed a familiar pattern: initial media attention, academic discomfort, and eventual quiet removal from discourse. Some were labeled hoaxes, others simply vanished from exhibition floors. Skeptical archaeologists insist that most OPARTs are either misinterpreted, misdated, or modern contaminants introduced into ancient layers by accident or deception. But the true controversy isn't in the artifacts themselves. It's in how institutions respond. Rather than investigating them transparently, many choose silence. Artifacts are omitted from catalogues, files are closed, and inquiries go unanswered. This lack of engagement feeds the growing belief that human history might be more layered and more non-linear than conventional narratives allow. Today, as visitors walk through the polished halls of world-renowned museums, few realize what lies beneath the storage rooms, locked drawers, and forgotten crates where hundreds of such anomalies may still exist. Not validated enough to display, yet not discarded as fakes, they remain in a peculiar limbo. Not part of history, but not erased from it either. The story of OPARTs is not necessarily one of deliberate conspiracy. It may reflect a deeper hesitation to confront the possibility that the story of civilization is far older, more complex, and perhaps more interrupted than we've been taught. Because if even one of these anomalous artifacts were authenticated beyond doubt, it wouldn't just challenge timelines, it would rewrite them. From the long-silenced OPARTs gathering dust in museum basements, the journey now shifts to the open waters of the East China Sea to a discovery as monumental as it is mysterious. The Yonaguni Monument, a submerged stone formation that sparked international fascination and bitter academic debate. Located just off Japan's westernmost island, a mere 110 kilometers from Taiwan, Yonaguni was first discovered in 1986 by local diver Kihachiro Aratic, while exploring the seabed around 25 meters below the surface. Aratic encountered a vast, geometric stone structure that defied easy explanation. Early underwater photographs stunned researchers. The formation featured massive terraced blocks, sharp right angles, smooth vertical walls, and what appeared to be carved steps and corridors. Intrigued, marine geologist Professor Masaki Kimura from the University of the Ryukyus launched an investigation. His team spent years documenting the site. In his reports, Kimura cautiously described the formation as a vast, possibly man-made complex complete with what resembled ceremonial stairs, narrow passageways, towering entry gates, and faint carvings. He even speculated that the site might date back over 10,000 years, submerged during the dramatic sea level rise at the end of the last ice age. If true, Yonaguni would represent a prehistoric civilization capable of monumental stone construction far earlier than anything recorded in East Asian history. But as attention mounted, Japan's academic institutions responded with increasing skepticism. The Geological Society of Japan issued a firm rebuttal, insisting that Yonaguni was nothing more than naturally eroded sandstone, sculpted by underwater currents and tectonic activity. According to their assessment, there was no evidence of human modification, no tool marks, no artifacts, no cultural layer. And so, once again, the narrative split in two. On one side, independent researchers who saw architectural intention in every carved step. On the other, mainstream on natural coincidence. What remains is a haunting monument beneath the sea, too orderly to be dismissed outright, too controversial to be embraced without challenge. Like so many ancient puzzles, Yonaguni lingers in a gray zone between recognition and denial, where the lines between myth, nature, and forgotten history are anything but clear. Even more curiously, Professor Kimura's own research team, the very group that had initially brought Yonaguni into global focus, began to retreat from the spotlight. By the early 2000s, International Canalib had dried up. Updates to their sonar imaging, structural maps, and sediment analysis stopped appearing. Funding proposals for further exploration quietly stalled. Without formal announcements, the once celebrated underwater discovery faded from public discourse. Independent researchers like Graham Hancock and documentary crews from outlets such as Channel 4 tried to step in. But they soon discovered that crucial materials, regional sonar scans, 3D models, and comparative geological data were no longer accessible. Data that had once been published had either vanished or become buried in institutional archives. Japanese academic circles, once intrigued by the site, began to distance themselves, concerned perhaps not by what was found, but by what it implied. Skeptics rushed to fill the vacuum. They insisted that Yonaguni was merely a geological curiosity, a cluster of sandstone formations shaped over time by tectonic activity and erosion. Sharp angles, terraces, and stair-like shapes, they argued, could emerge naturally. Case closed. But if the site is merely a natural formation, why have so many of the original dataset scans, sediment cores, seismic readings disappeared from academic scrutiny? Why were peer-reviewed updates abruptly halted? Even today, Visitors can hire local divers to descend into the turquoise depths off Yonaguni's coast. There, beneath the waves, they can run their hands along precision-carved ledges, right angles, and corridors that echo architecture, not accident. And yet, no comprehensive survey combining both geological and archaeological analysis has ever been released in full. No official conclusion has been universally accepted. The mystery of Yonaguni no longer simply asks what lies beneath. It asks something deeper. Why was a potentially paradigm-shifting discovery first celebrated, then suffocated in silence? Was it fear of rewriting prehistory, institutional discomfort with anything resembling alternative chronology, or simply an unwillingness to explore a hypothesis that stepped too far beyond the bounds of acceptable scholarship? If Yonaguni challenges our understanding of ancient engineering beneath the sea, the story of Europe's medieval architecture presents a more subtle dilemma, not of what we built, but when we built it. Since the 19th century, as historians and architects catalogued Europe's medieval cathedrals, castles, and fortifications, two main sources of dating were used: official records from royal or ecclesiastical lists, and stylistic architectural analysis. But cracks began to show in this framework, sometimes quite literally. In England, France, and Germany, restoration efforts revealed that several so-called medieval structures were sitting atop much older foundations. Subterranean passages, blocks, and mortar layers hinted at Roman or even pre-Roman techniques. Yet these findings were often sidelined. Take the famed Gothic cathedrals of Chartres, Reims, and Strasbourg. During their 19th century restorations, architects like Eugene Vieux-le-Duc noted foundation stones carved in styles typical of Roman craftsmanship. But these findings were left vague in public reports, folded into restoration notes, and never fully incorporated into the official dating. Why? Because such projects were often overseen by the church and state institutions, bodies with vested interests in presenting Christian medieval Europe as the birthplace of high architecture. In England, debate swirled around the Tower of London and Dover Castle. Deep beneath the surface, archaeologists encountered mortar compositions and construction patterns reminiscent of late Roman engineering. Early 20th century scholars like Frederick Bleibond openly questioned whether many Norman or Plantagenet-era buildings had simply been superimposed atop ancient ruins while the dates were retrofitted to match political narratives. His views were met with resistance, even ridicule, and ultimately faded from mainstream discourse. In Germany, the revered Marxburg Castle, long held as a pristine example of 13th century feudal fortification, underwent limited radiocarbon testing in 1972. The results, taken from mortar and embedded charcoal samples, returned anomalously early dates, suggesting sections of the site predated official construction timelines by centuries. Yet the findings were dismissed as outliers, and the standard 13th century classification remained untouched. Some argue that such discrepancies are easily explained by cultural layering, the common medieval practice of repurposing older Roman walls, fortresses, or roads as structural bases. And while this is partly true, the deeper issue lies not in the reuse of materials, but in the erasure of that reuse from the historical narrative. Often, these older layers are quietly bundled into the newer dating, creating the illusion of singular, uninterrupted construction. This approach has led to uncomfortable questions. How much of medieval Europe's architectural legacy is genuinely medieval? And how much of it is a palimpsest ancient bones dressed in newer skin, rebranded to serve dynastic pride or religious continuity. The problem is worsened by lost or deliberately obscured documentation. At Chartres Cathedral, foundational survey notes from the 19th century vanished during World War II bombings. In other cases, sections of archives appear missing, redacted, or never released. In such silences, revision thrives. Some scholars insist this is not conspiracy but convenience. A simplified, linear history is easier to teach, easier to memorialize, and easier to attach to national or religious identity. After all, it's tidier to declare a wall 12th century than to admit its bricks may have stood there 1,000 years earlier under a forgotten name, in a forgotten tongue. Yet today, as we walk beneath towering arches or through the shadowed halls of medieval castles, few pause to wonder how many layers of forgotten past lie hidden beneath our feet. How often has history been overwritten, not with malice, but with intent to streamline, when independent researchers suggest that some of these structures may predate their official timelines by hundreds, sometimes thousands of years, the reply is often silence, not refutation, not rebuttal, just silence. And so, as we leave behind the stone facades of Europe where history may have been subtly edited to support the stories we prefer, we turn eastward to a culture celebrated for its record-keeping, Imperial China. The Song dynasty, which ruled from the 10th to 13th centuries, left behind one of the most extensive historical archives in East Asia: official dynastic histories, exhaustive chronicles, and detailed bureaucratic records. But hidden within this mountain of material are subtle indicators of strategic revision, signs that even the most comprehensive histories may have been quietly rewritten. From the reign of Emperor Tizu to Ningzong Song, court historians meticulously documented daily court life, imperial edicts, military campaigns, natural disasters, and political intrigues. Works like the History of the Song, the extended continuation of Zizi Tungjian Comprehensive Mirror to aid in government, Changbian and Songshi Yao became canonical texts, definitive reference points for generations of scholars. What is less often discussed, however, is that these monumental texts were subjected to two major waves of editorial control, each carefully supervised by imperial authority or state bureaucracy. Modern research reveals that the first wave of edits began shortly after Emperor Taizu consolidated power following the chaos of the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period. To legitimize the new Song order, many earlier events were subtly commanders who resisted were rebranded as rebels. Rival courts were erased or diminished. The Song regime was portrayed as the singular restorer of order in a fractured China. In early northern Song records, original entries were trimmed or rewritten, often adopting a harsher tone toward dissenting figures. The second major revision occurred under the Yuan dynasty, which conquered the Song. A committee of official historians, under the watchful eyes of the Yuan court, compiled a new version of the Song record, the Song Shi, which remains the most cited version today. This compilation is vast, precise, and structured, but scholars like Chen Yink and Chen Menjia noticed strange anomalies, prominent figures vanishing without explanation, and major political trials reduced to a single vague sentence, or entirely omitted. One such case involves the official Lu Wend, who had advocated for reform during Emperor Shaozong's reign. Contemporary sources describe how he was wrongfully accused, later vindicated, and even reinstated. Yet in the Song Shi, his rehabilitation disappears, leaving only the image of a disgraced traitor. Why omit the truth? possibly because Yuan historians had little interest in preserving the reputations of reformers aligned with Song ideals. Another example, the secret negotiations between the Southern Song and the Jin dynasty. Contemporary court documents referenced direct correspondence between envoys, yet in the official Song Shi, these are replaced by second-hand summaries. No explanation was offered, but many believe Yuan editors intentionally suppressed records of Southern Song concessions to avoid unsettling their fragile hold over recently conquered territories. What's striking is how many modern academics still treat the Song Shi as authoritative, citing its clarity, its consistency. But that very coherence should raise suspicions. When a fallen dynasty's history is written by its conquerors, where is the line between documentation and propaganda? To this day, large portions of the Song Chronicle remain unverified against local archives. Private diaries and stone inscriptions scattered across China. Independent researchers attempt to fragments, but their work is often dismissed, too speculative, too disruptive to accepted timelines. And perhaps the most sobering question is this: if a powerful and literate state like the Song could rewrite trial records, erase diplomatic correspondence, and still pass down a version of history copied for centuries, how much of what we call history is truly what happened, and how much is just what we were allowed to remember? If the Song Chronicles reveal how victors shaped the past, then ancient Egypt offers a different, darker tale, that of a ruler erased by his own people, a ruler whose original records still lie sealed in archives, their contents hidden from the world over 3,000 years ago. Pharaoh Akhenaten came to power and launched one of the most radical religious revolutions in Egyptian history. He declared Aten, the solar disk, as the sole deity, challenging the dominance of the centuries-old priesthood devoted to Ammon. Akhenaten ordered a new capital built Takhetaten. Modern-day Amarna reshaped Egypt's rituals, art, and historical records. But after his death, the Egyptian elite moved quickly to erase his legacy through a damnatio memoria, formal condemnation of memory. His name was chiseled out of temple walls, his imagest, and his reforms undone. In later dynastic records, he is mentioned only as a criminal or heretic king. And yet, many of Akhenaten's original records, royal letters, administrative decrees, detailed memos, were not destroyed. Instead, they were sealed away, hidden in temple vaults, tombs, and storage rooms across Egypt. In the 19th century, European teams began excavating Amarna, unearthing thousands of clay tablets, what came to be known as the Amarna letters. Some were published, revealing a fragile Egypt struggling to maintain control of its empire as its court became consumed by religious upheaval. But most of these records remain unpublished, stored deep within the Cairo Museum, the British Museum, and private collections across Europe. Scholars like Nicholas Reeves and Aidan Dodson have asked a troubling question: why, after more than a century, have so few of these primary sources been released? The official explanations: lack of resources, shortage of translators, conservation priorities seem plausible, but others suspect deeper motives. If fully revealed, the Amarna archive might show that Akhenaten was not merely a religious shialot, but a visionary reformer, one who threatened the entrenched political order and was erased because of it. One particularly mysterious thread involves the succession crisis following Akhenaten's death. Among the sealed documents are rumored references to the relationship between Tutankhamun and Nefertiti. Some scholars believe Nefertiti may have ruled in her own right, possibly as pharaoh. Smenkhkarand, that Tutankhamun may not have been Akhenaten's son at all. If proven, this would not just rewrite Egypt's dynastic timeline, it would challenge modern claims to royal lineage and heritage. In contemporary Egypt, access to the Amarna archive remains highly restricted. Only a handful of researchers are granted permits. Excavations are tightly monitored. Scholars whisper of entire tombs left untouched, sealed chambers holding the final chapters of a story we were never meant to read. And so, we must ask again, if a civilization as monumental as Egypt could erase a king, suppress sacred archives, and alter divine memory, how many truths have we lost to silence? And what remains buried beneath the sand, waiting, still sealed, just beyond the edge of what we call history? Among archaeologists, there's an old half-joking adage: Amarna is always open. She just never invites you in. Tourists today gather in awe around the golden mask of Tutankhamun, oblivious to the fact that, just a few hundred meters away, unopened wooden crates contain the unfinished story of his father, the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten. These sealed boxes have rested in quiet neglect, untouched for generations. And yet a deeper question haunts the edges of every excavation. If the Amarna tablets were one day fully translated, if every hidden record and fragment were brought to light, how many foundational chapters of Egyptian history would be overturned? How much of what we consider truth would have to be rewritten from the ground up? Amarna reveals how power can erase a king from collective memory. But it is in medieval Europe that we see a far more calculated and enduring project, one in which the church became not just a guardian of knowledge, but its ultimate gatekeeper, determining what was allowed to survive and what was condemned to oblivion. Beginning in the 4th century, as Christianity was adopted as the official religion of the Roman Empire, the church quickly constructed a sweeping system of intellectual control, one that extended far beyond theology. It asserted dominance over history, philosophy, natural sciences, and even medicine. By the High Middle Ages, cathedral schools and later Europe's first universities had become monopolized by ecclesiastical authority. These institutions did safeguard some of antiquity's treasures, the Latin language, Roman law, and fragments of classical literature, but they also instituted a rigorous filter. Ideas were not preserved freely. They were curated, edited, and often expunged. One early casualty of this system was Origen of Alexandria, a 3rd century Christian theologian, who wrote extensively on scripture and cosmology. Among his boldest claims are the pre-existence of souls, the ultimate salvation of all beings, and the potential redemption of evil itself. These ideas, radical even by modern standards, were eventually condemned as heresy. By the time of the Second Council of Constantinople in 553 CE, Origen was denounced, and his vast body of work was systematically destroyed, surviving only in fragments quoted by later authors in monastic settings. Another striking example lies in ancient medical knowledge. Works by Hippocrates and Galen were initially preserved by Islamic scholars and reintroduced to Europe through Arabic translations. But the Church demanded that these texts be heavily censored. Any passage suggesting that disease stemmed from natural causes rather than divine punishment, that the body functioned independently of the soul, was removed or rewritten. Scientific curiosity was tolerated only insofar as it affirmed theological orthodoxy. By the 13th century, this control reached its peak. Under Pope Innocent III, papal decrees mandated that all universities adhere strictly to approved curricula. Any unauthorized writings by Aristotle, especially those dealing with natural philosophy, were banned. In 1210, the Council of Paris declared, "No one shall teach or listen to the natural philosophy of Aristotle, either in public or in private." Even as interest in reason and observation began to grow, such mandates made it clear truth was not something to be was something to be authorized. Despite these restrictions, many scholars attempted to push the boundaries. Roger Bacon, an English thinker ahead of his time, conducted experiments in optics and alchemy. He was closely monitored and ultimately placed under house arrest for his inquiries. His case was far from unique. Innovation was tolerated only at the margins, and often under threat of punishment. The Church soon institutionalized this authority through one of the most infamous instruments of intellectual censorship in Western history. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of prohibited books. Established in 1559, the index would survive nearly 4 centuries. It banned works deemed heretical, subversive, or morally dangerous. Among the authors blacklisted were Copernicus, Galileo, Giordano Bruno, and Baruch Spinoza. In its harshest periods, owning these texts could result in the confiscation of property, imprisonment, or even death. To be fair, the Church also preserved vast amounts of ancient knowledge. In the scriptoria of monasteries, countless classical texts were copied and recopied by hand. Without this labor, much of the Greco-Roman intellectual legacy might have vanished entirely. But preservation is not the same as transmission. What was saved often came with alterations. What was taught was curated to serve doctrinal ends. And that leads us to a sobering question. If every manuscript had to pass through a theological filter before reaching the eyes of students and scholars, how can we be sure we are reading truth and not a version of history rewritten to serve authority? This monopoly on knowledge reached its most secretive expression in the Vatican itself, specifically within the walls of the Vatican Secret Archives, now officially known as the Vatican Apostolic Archive. This immense repository, located adjacent to the Vatican Library, is one of the largest and most enigmatic collections of historical documents in the world. It spans nearly 90 kilometers, roughly 55 miles of shelving. Inside are diplomatic correspondences, papal bulls, internal memoranda, court diaries, inquisitorial records, and confidential letters exchanged between popes and monarchs, dating from the 8th century to the modern era. At first glance, it might seem like a treasure trove open to any serious scholar. But for centuries, the archive was completely off limits. The term secretum in Latin did not originally mean secret in the modern sense. It meant private or personal. But the effect was the same. Access was heavily restricted, and its contents were shielded from public view, fueling generations of speculation. Only in 1881 did Pope Leo XIII authorize limited scholarly access. Since then, a small number of carefully vetted academics have been granted entry, but under strict conditions. Applicants must submit detailed credentials and letters of recommendation and identify precisely which documents they wish to consult. Even then, many materials remain inaccessible. Others are so vast or so fragile that they remain unread, untouched, waiting perhaps deliberately for time or silence to erase their relevance. The archive has become a symbol not just of religious secrecy, but of how institutions with the power to record history can also choose to obscure it. And so we must ask, as we peer into these dimly lit corridors of parchment and ink, are we uncovering the past or merely glimpsing the version of it we've been permitted to see? Browsing is not permitted. Photocopying entire documents is strictly forbidden. Researchers are allowed only a limited number of files per day, and even their handwritten notes must be reviewed before they leave the reading room. Those who've been granted access describe the experience not as academic, but ritualistic, almost sacred. Security checkpoints, long corridors bathed in amber light, heavy iron doors creaking open into vast, silent chambers. Wooden cabinets, older than many nations, line the halls, holding handwritten indexes compiled centuries before the birth of modern democracy. Step even slightly beyond your assigned area, and your access is revoked on the spot. What lies in those chambers, deep within the Vatican Secret Archives, has been the subject of speculation for generations. Documents that, if revealed, could reshape the very foundation of Western history. Among them, the full trial transcripts of Galileo Galilei's posing not just a clash between science and faith, but a deeper political reckoning within the Church. The suppressed records of the Knights Templar, including the sealed testimonies and verdicts that dismantled one of the most powerful orders of the Middle Ages. Confidential letters between monarchs and popes, revealing secret bargains, betrayals, and geopolitical maneuvers omitted from any textbook. And the documentation behind the Treaty of Tordesillas, the papal sanctioned agreement that divided the New World between Spain and Portugal, legally justifying centuries of colonization. In 2003, the Vatican released a fragment of these archives. The interrogation record of Jacques de Molay, the final Templar Grand Master. Perhaps it was an attempt to quiet the growing suspicion, but ironically, that selective transparency only deepened public curiosity. If there's truly nothing to hide, why do over 85 kilometers of shelves remain sealed? Defenders of Vatican secrecy claimed these measures are necessary to protect fragile manuscripts, prevent misinterpretation, and stop the weaponization of sensitive content. But critics ask a harder question. When the largest archive in Christendom opens only a sliver to the world, who decides which truths survive and which are buried? And more urgently, could our understanding of the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and the Enlightenment be shaped more by what was withheld than what was ever revealed? Today, the Vatican Secret Archives remain a mythic labyrinth, a silent vault of memory where letters centuries old sit in stillness, waiting, or perhaps never waiting at all. And the haunting question still lingers. If the entirety of those archives were ever unveiled, what truths about human civilization would we be forced to rewrite? If the Vatican's archives represent the power to withhold knowledge behind locked doors, then the Jesuit order, the Society of Jesus, represents a subtler, more pervasive form of power, the ability to shape knowledge itself from its very root. Founded in 1540 during the height of the Counter-Reformation, the Jesuits emerged not simply as missionaries, but as intellectual strategists. While Protestantism surged through Europe, Lutheranism, Calvinism, and radical new philosophies, the Catholic Church found itself in crisis. Papal decrees and inquisitorial courts were no longer enough. The Church needed a deeper weapon, control over the way knowledge itself was formed. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuit order, understood this with frightening clarity. The battlefield was not the pulpit, it was the school, the classroom, the lecture hall, the seminar. It was here that future elites, philosophers, scientists, and rulers were being shaped. It was here the Church would reclaim its dominance. Within decades, Jesuit colleges sprang up across Europe and its colonies, from Paris to Prague, Goa to Mexico City, and Rome to Lima. By the 17th century, Jesuit education had become the gold standard for Catholic elites. But these weren't just seminaries. They taught mathematics, classical literature, astronomy, and natural sciences, yet always within boundaries drawn by theological orthodoxy. What made the Jesuit model so effective was its sophistication, outward tolerance, inward control. A student might study Aristotle or Euclid, even Copernicus, but never in ways that questioned the Church's divine authority. Inquiry was welcomed, but only in service of metaphysical obedience. Take their approach to astronomy. When Copernicus published his heliocentric model in 1543, Jesuit scholars initially taught it cautiously as a mathematical convenience. But when Galileo asserted it as physical truth, everything changed. Jesuit curricula were revised. The heliocentric model could be mentioned, but only as an abstract tool, not a fact. The idea that Earth orbited the Sun was silently erased from formal instruction. In philosophy, the control was even more precise. The Ratio Studiorum, the Jesuits' official guide to education, published in 1599, dictated not just which texts were allowed, but also how they must be taught. Entire passages were omitted. Thinkers like Descartes and Francis Bacon were included, but only when their ideas were framed as supporting, never challenging, divine authority. This was the brilliance and the danger of the Jesuit model. They preserved ancient texts, stabilized education through chaos, and spread classical learning across continents. Yet beneath the surface, many historians ask, did they also pre-engineer Western thought to ensure it never dared pierce the ceiling of ecclesiastical power? The influence endured. For centuries, many of Europe's most powerful administrators, Spain, Portugal, France, and beyond, passed through Jesuit institutions. They emerged not just with knowledge, but with a worldview. Science is permitted, but only when it kneels before theology. Reason is valued, but only when tamed. Even after the suppression of the Jesuits in 1773, under pressure from secular monarchs there, educational machinery survived. The Ratio Studiorum remained a silent blueprint in many European universities. The principle of soft ideological oversight was already embedded. Today, the Jesuits are often praised for their intellectual rigor and commitment to education. And indeed, in times of cultural collapse, their institutions preserved order and continuity. But still, a quiet question echoes among historians and philosophers alike: when a single institution is at once missionary, censor, and teacher, can truth ever be taught without intent? Like the Vatican's archives, the Jesuit educational legacy is a mirror held up to civilization, not to show us what we know, but to reveal who decides what can be known. Because the most dangerous form of censorship is not what's banned outright. It is what's allowed, but only within invisible walls. Walls drawn not by truth, but by power. For centuries, the church and religious institutions held dominion over how humanity understood the world. Then came the Enlightenment age that promised liberation through reason and science. Geometry, once considered sacred and symbolic, was redefined as a sterile mathematical system. But a quiet question lingers beneath the surface of our textbooks and digital diagrams. Have we forgotten what these ancient symbols were truly meant to express? Or worse, has their meaning been deliberately stripped away? Sacred geometry is not a fringe concept. It was central to nearly every ancient civilization. The Egyptians constructed the pyramids in harmony with the golden ratio. The Greeks designed the Parthenon using mathematical proportions believed to reflect divine order. In India, mandalas were mapped with symbolic precision, serving as spiritual diagrams of the universe. These patterned circles, spirals, six-pointed stars, and lotus flowers were not just construction tools. They were visual metaphors for the invisible, sacred links between the cosmos and the self. But as scientific thought advanced, especially during the 19th century, geometry was divorced from its philosophical and mystical roots. It was reduced to a list of rigid definitions: points, lines, angles, and polygons. Concepts like the flower of life, Metatron's cube, or the divine ratio were dismissed as mystical curiosities or fringe. Theories excluded entirely from mainstream education. What was once a language of harmony became a dead lexicon of proofs and equations. Researchers like Keith Critchlow and Robert Lawler have argued that this transition was not accidental. It was part of a broader intellectual movement, deliberate desacralization of knowledge. By severing symbol from story, meaning was replaced with function. Geometry was no longer a bridge between worlds. It became a technical exercise, devoid of soul. In the name of scientific purity, those who spoke of geometry's symbolic power were dismissed as irrational or unacademic. And yet the ancient world left countless clues. The flower of life is etched on the walls of the Assyrian Abydos, reappearing centuries later on Renaissance tombstones and in Islamic mosaics. Scholars of the 19th and early 20th centuries recognized its global presence. But as the modern world embraced materialism, these interpretations were quietly removed from scholarly dialogue. Take the pentagram of five-pointed star. To the Pythagoreans, it symbolized health, harmony, and the human microcosm, perfect reflection of cosmic balance. But as religious authorities rose in power, the symbol was recast as occult and heretical. By the modern era, it had been sanitized in schoolbooks, reduced to a geometric figure used to teach angles, its ancient philosophical meaning erased in silence. Some argue this transformation is a natural consequence of intellectual specialization. Mathematics separated from philosophy, science from spirituality. But this raises a deeper concern. When we strip sacred meaning from ancient knowledge, what else do we lose? For ancient cultures, geometry wasn't just measurement. It was a silent theology, a way to speak of the infinite without words. Even today, a handful of voices attempt to revive this lost language. Architect and theorist Christopher Alexander argued that certain shapes and proportions have measurable psychological effects, that sacred geometry isn't just beautiful, it's functional, healing, and deeply human. But such ideas remain at the margins, rarely integrated into architectural education or urban planning. When a child opens a modern geometry textbook, they see clean diagrams, formulas, and angles, but they are not taught why these forms once shaped temples, healed the sick, and anchored entire civilizations in cosmic rhythm. And perhaps that is the quietest tragedy of all. When knowledge loses its story, it loses its power to inspire, to unify, to mean. If sacred geometry was silenced through reduction, the field of Mesopotamian archaeology reveals another form of distortion, one where history was not just forgotten, but rewritten through selective translation and ideological filters. When European archaeologists in the 19th century unearthed the ruins of Sumer and Akkad, they uncovered a civilization that predated Egypt and Greece. Thousands of clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform revealed law codes, trade records, hymns, and creation myths, evidence of advanced urban culture as early as the 4th millennium BCE. These findings should have redefined humanity's timeline. Instead, they became a battlefield. Translation of these texts was not a neutral act. Scholars, many of whom were funded by religious or nationalist institutions, often altered the content to align with existing worldviews. In the 1870s, George Smith translated the Epic of Atrahasis, a flood myth predating the Bible's story of Noah. Though the parallels were obvious, Smith omitted critical sections, including the moment when the god Enlil expresses remorse for unleashing the flood. Such a portrayal of divine fallibility was too radical for the era's theological boundaries. Only decades later did more complete translations emerge. But by then, simplified narratives had already filtered into public consciousness and school. Curricula sanitized, edited, and made to conform to prevailing religious structures. Sumerian law codes suffered a similar fate. Early scholars emphasized parallels to the Old Testament, glossing over aspects that didn't fit, like the Sumerians' emphasis on restorative justice, compensation, and social repair. These systems were nuanced and humane, yet Western academia focused solely on what validated its own biblical heritage. Even the Sumerian king lists a chronicle of rulers who allegedly reigned for tens of thousands of years was edited down. Original timelines, citing 28,800 years, were quietly rewritten as 288 years to avoid contradictions with biblical chronology. Only in modern transliterations have the vast scales of these claims been reintroduced. All of this reveals a troubling pattern. When history conflicts with dominant narratives, it is not preserved, it is reshaped. The loss is not just factual, it is existential. The truths embedded in ancient symbols and forgotten languages offer more than academic curiosity. They offer insight into how our ancestors saw the world, not as a random collection of facts, but as a living story where form, number, and myth converged to reduce geometry to abstraction in ancient texts. To theology excerpts is to sever our connection to the wisdom that once guided entire civilizations. Most published translations of ancient Mesopotamian texts are not what they seem. The widely circulated versions we find in libraries, schools, and online databases are often edited for tone, content, and theological compatibility. Entire phrases and ideas are softened, redacted, or reworded to align with modern sensibilities. But this raises a deeper concern when ancient civilizations are interpreted through the theological and political lens of a much later era. We are no longer studying history, we are studying a filtered echo. To their credit, many modern scholars have attempted to correct this distortion. Since the mid-20th century, independent academic teams in Germany, Japan, and the United States have released more faithful, line-by-line translations, meticulously with original cuneiform signs. Yet these accurate versions are seldom included in standard textbooks. Why? Because they are complex, difficult to teach, and sometimes unsettling. Instead, educators often prefer simplified summaries, digestible, uncontroversial, and easier to fit within tidy historical narratives. And so, anyone seeking to truly understand the voice of Sumer or A-code must make a choice: settle for polished summaries that erase complexity, or wade through thousands of dense sign charts and untranslated tablets. But those who choose the latter often discover something astonishing: that the voices of these civilizations were stranger, more sophisticated, and more spiritually nuanced than our modern frameworks are willing to admit. And perhaps the real question is not whether the distortion was intentional, but whether it stemmed from a quiet fear of encountering truths that did not fit the stories we had already decided to believe. If the manipulation of Sumerian language reveals how easily knowledge can be reshaped through translation, then the suppression of out-of-sequence archaeological discoveries reveals something even more troubling: the fear that science itself may punish those who question its foundational assumptions. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, researchers in archaeology, geology, and anthropology made extraordinary discoveries of human artifacts or advanced tools found in strata far older than humanity was believed to exist. These findings didn't just spark debate, they ruined careers. One of the most striking cases is that of Dr. Virginia Stein McIntyre, an American geologist who participated in a 1966 excavation at Hueyatlaco, Mexico. There, her team uncovered sophisticated stone tools buried beneath layers of volcanic ash. Using multiple dating methods, including uranium series and zircon fission track analysis, they concluded the site was approximately 250,000 years old. That date alone challenged everything. According to mainstream chronology, Homo sapiens didn't yet exist, let alone tool-making cultures. Initially, the team prepared to publish their results, but the response was swift and unforgiving. Critics dismissed the findings, claiming dating errors or suggesting the tools had somehow slipped into older strata. When Dr. Stein McIntyre defended the integrity of the data, she was quietly pushed to the margins. Scientific journals refused to publish her work. Contracts were revoked. Research opportunities vanished. Years later, she wrote, "I wasn't rejected for weak data. I was rejected because my data didn't fit the story they wanted to preserve." Another example, Thomas Lee, a Canadian archaeologist. In the 1950s, he excavated thousands of stone tools near Lake Huron, found embedded in glacial Tilsog, suggesting human presence in North America far earlier than the accepted migration via the Bering Land Bridge. When he refused to recant, he was dismissed. His collection was locked away in museum storage, and his funding was eliminated. He spent the rest of his life unable to pursue further research. Then there's Michael Cremo, author of Forbidden Archaeology, who spent decades compiling overlooked archaeological reports from the 19th and 20th centuries. He uncovered hundreds of cases where artifacts were removed from public archives, simply because they appeared too early, out of sync with established timelines. While some cases may indeed have involved flawed methods, many were never re-examined. They were dismissed not because the evidence was debunked, but because it was never allowed to be tested again. To be clear, science must demand rigorous standards, but a paradox emerges. Truly disruptive evidence is often excluded before it can be scrutinized. Not for its lack of credibility, but for the threat it poses to a long-standing framework. Today, when such discoveries are mentioned, they are often relegated to the margins as fringe ideas, unworthy of serious attention. Yet independent researchers continue to ask, if these findings are wrong, why not disprove them through transparent analysis? Why respond instead with silence, erasure, or exile? The uncomfortable truth is that, like all institutions, science is not immune to inertia. Once a consensus hardens over generations, new data, no matter how credible, is viewed not as insight, but as destabilization, and very few are willing to gamble their careers, reputations, or identities to defend evidence that contradicts the dominant model. And so, in the silence that follows, legend grows. Legends of ancient civilizations far older than history admits. Legends of advanced humans whose traces were buried not only by time, but by academic discomfort. Or perhaps just the legend of a scientific world that, while noble in its pursuit of truth, still fears the chaos of data that doesn't conform. If a single site can end a career, then within the more discrete spaces of modern academia, censorship has learned to operate without overt force. In international conferences, those polished gatherings hosted by universities, research councils, and intergovernmental bodies, gatekeeping no longer requires bans or blacklists. It arrives with a single, carefully chosen phrase: conflicts, with research direction. These conferences are meant to be sanctuaries of open inquiries. Scholars debate evidence, share breakthroughs, and challenge old assumptions. But when a discovery crosses a certain invisible line, especially one that challenges chronology, pre-civilizational timelines, or the simplicity of linear human development, it quietly disappears from the program. One such instance occurred in Germany at a 2012 conference focused on Göbekli Tepe, the 12,000-year-old megalithic site in southeastern Turkey. A group of Eastern European archaeologists submitted a paper arguing the site's alignments had astronomical significance. Their thesis, that Göbekli Tepe was not just a ritual structure, but an observatory evidence of sophisticated societal organization long before the rise of agriculture. Their submission was rejected. No detailed critique, no peer-reviewed debate, just a quiet omission. In the end, the question is not whether the system is broken, but whether it is too afraid of what lies beyond its boundaries. For knowledge, like excavation, requires courage, and sometimes the most revealing truths are buried not beneath stone or ash but beneath the frameworks we refuse to question. The abstract had been accepted, and their presentation was slotted into the official conference program. But just weeks before the event, the paper vanished, withdrawn quietly, without announcement, accompanied only by a vague note, lacking academic maturity. A polite euphemism meant not to question Theodata, but to avoid the disruption it might cause. In 1999, at a North American prehistory conference hosted by a prominent US university, an independent archaeologist prepared to present findings from a controversial site in South Carolina. There, stone fragments suggested human presence dating back over 50,000 years, tens of thousands beyond the accepted timeline for habitation in the Americas. The abstract passed initial peer review, but when several funders raised concerns, the organizing committee pulled the paper. The reason given was insufficient consensus. Behind closed doors, colleagues warned the researcher to accept the quiet exclusion rather than ignite public controversy. Similar patterns emerge across disciplines. In Egyptology, papers exploring the possibility of undisclosed chambers beneath the Great Pyramid of Giza are routinely omitted from official proceedings, even when radar scans and seismic surveys are published in lesser-known journals. Such topics are kept out of mainstream platforms. The justification: avoiding sensationalism that could damage Egyptology's scientific credibility. But beneath the civility lies a two-tier system of gatekeeping. The first tier, peer review, is a necessary safeguard for academic integrity. The second, more opaque, is institutional caution. Organizers and funders alike grow uneasy when research threatens to shift long-set historical paradigms. Some defend this as pragmatic a way to shield disciplines from media distortion and pseudo-scientific co-optation. After all, premature exposure of unverified theories can cast doubt on entire fields. Yet critics ask a deeper question: if controversial evidence is consistently withheld or delayed, how can it ever be objectively evaluated? How can knowledge evolve if it is selectively quarantined? As a result, significant topics like early human migration, ancient intercontinental trade, or advanced prehistoric astronomy often remain buried in internal memos or obscure journals with little academic reach. These theories are not necessarily disproven, they are sidelined, and so a quiet tension persists. How many discoveries have been silenced not because they were invalid, but because they risked undermining the historical scaffolding we rely on? Today, as we browse polished academic programs filled with hundreds of safe, consensus-friendly topics, few stop to consider what might be missing. Beyond the scheduled talks and printed abstracts, there may exist a second, invisible list papers, crossed out in silence, never delivered, never heard. And sometimes, the suppression of uncomfortable history moves beyond ideas into physical reality. One of the most perplexing examples is the disappearance of 13 sealed crates containing Inca and pre-Inca artifacts. The crates vanished in transit between Peru and Europe in the early 20th century, leaving no credible explanation and no official closure. The story begins in 1926, during a joint archaeological expedition in Peru's Ayacucho region, former hub of the ancient Wari civilization, which predated and was later absorbed by the Inca Empire. Over 4 months, Peruvian and French researchers excavated a remarkable collection of artifacts: gold, funerary masks, intricately inscribed ceramic plates, and stone statues depicting figures wearing unfamiliar headdresses. Some objects bore stylistic elements alien to Inca art motifs, more reminiscent of Mesoamerican or even Polynesian cultures. Customs documents confirm that the artifacts were packed into 13 wooden crates, sealed and signed off by both Peruvian and French authorities. The plan was to ship half the collection to Paris for restoration and study, and return the other half to Lima for public display. On August 12, 1927, the crates left the port of Callao aboard a French freight vessel bound for Le Havre. But when the ship docked in France, the crates were gone. The shipping company claimed the cargo had been offloaded at an unscheduled transfer port, but no record ever identified the location. Insurance claims stalled due to vague ownership. The shipment was state-sponsored, leaving no private claimant to press the matter. The Peruvian government issued an official protest. The French Ministry of Culture responded with a short note. The shipment had likely been misplaced during transit. The case quietly faded from public view. The sheer scale of the loss, 13 large, documented crates, is staggering. But even more suspicious is the nature of the contents. Field notes and photographs taken before packing revealed a number of anomalies. 3 carved stone objects resembling ancient sea vessels, a disc etched with coastal maps that didn't correspond to known Inca geography, and gold masks featuring spiral motifs absent from any recognized Peruvian collection. Speculation flourished. Some believe the crates were intercepted and sold to elite European collectors during a boom in the black market trade of pre-Columbian artifacts. Others suggest the disappearance was no accident, but a deliberate act meant to prevent the dissemination of artifacts that could append long-held assumptions about transoceanic contact before Columbus. Such theories remain outside mainstream history, but they persist. In 1951, a journalist with Paris Match attempted to investigate the case in the Le Havre port archives. All 1927 cargo records, however, had been destroyed during World War II. Museums involved in the expedition claimed to have no surviving receipts, only scattered correspondence and vague references to the project. For decades, the story remained anecdotal. Then, in 1996, a Swiss collector publicly exhibited a gold mask he claimed was from the missing shipment, though impossible to authenticate conclusively. Its punched holes and spiral patterns closely matched a 1926 sketch from the expedition archive. the case briefly returned to the headlines. Peru's government promised a new investigation, but no answers followed. Silence reclaimed the story once again. Today, few Peruvian scholars revisit the incident, perhaps because it forces uncomfortable questions into the light. Who determines what artifacts are preserved and which are quietly lost? Which items disappear by accident and which vanish because their existence is too disruptive? And when history is edited not by evidence but by absence, how much do we truly know? Behind the museum walls, within the locked drawers of national archives, and somewhere in the shadowy silence of bureaucratic erasure, fragments of truth remain hidden. And if we are not careful, the shape of our history will be determined not by what we've found, but by what we were never allowed to see. Once intended for those missing 13 crates, we're brought to a sobering truth. History doesn't always disappear in the fires of war or the chaos of natural disaster. Sometimes it vanishes in silence, carefully guided by the unseen hands that curate our collective memory. If the mysterious disappearance of 13 crates of ancient Peruvian artifacts marked a rupture in the chain of cultural transmission, then the story of the Smithsonian Institution, the largest museum and research complex in the United States, reveals a quieter, more methodical kind of erasure. Not through destruction, but through selective omission, through restricted access, edited archives, and the quiet redirection of public understanding towards safe, sanitized conclusions. Founded in 1846 under the noble mission to increase and diffuse knowledge, the Smithsonian today houses over 150 million objects. Yet between 1930 and 1960, a growing number of historians and independent researchers began asking questions that were both precise and troubling. Why were so many thoroughly documented archaeological discoveries either unpublished, unverified, or mysteriously absent from public record? One of the most persistent mysteries involves the so-called giant skeletons. Between the 1880s and 1920s, excavation teams across the Ohio Valley and Appalachian regions reported human remains that stood over 8 feet tall, buried alongside copper tools, ceremonial relics, and artifacts inconsistent with known indigenous burial customs. Preliminary reports were submitted to the Smithsonian, and some findings even made their way into early scientific publications like the American Antiquarian and Scientific American. But by the 1930s, detailed records and physical evidence began vanishing from public archives. According to researchers such as Vine Deloria Jr., this was no clerical oversight. In 1944, a private archaeological group requested access to examine the remains. The Smithsonian responded curtly. The records either didn't exist or had been reclassified. When the matter reached the US Congress in 1950, Smithsonian officials denied any policy of suppression, yet they could not produce a single document explaining the missing case files. Another layer of mystery surrounds the Lovelock Cave site. In Nevada, their anthropologists unearthed bones, woven fabrics, and ancient tools, some dating back over 4,000 years. Certain skulls reportedly bore anatomical features not aligned with any known indigenous population. But by the 1950s, these artifacts had been removed from public display. The original research survives today only in fragments, footnotes, obscure citations, and second-hand descriptions from those who once had access beyond physical remains. The Smithsonian was also suspected of quietly filtering radiocarbon dating results from excavation sites that suggested far earlier human presence than allowed by the prevailing Clovis First model, which held that humans entered the Americas no earlier than 13,000 years ago. At several Western sites, organic samples returned dates exceeding 15,000 years. Rather than publishing or debating them, such findings were routinely dismissed as contaminated and quietly excluded from formal studies. Some scholars argue that this pattern wasn't the result of a formal conspiracy, but a kind of institutional self-censorship and unspoken defense mechanism. Evidence that challenges dominant theories, they say, poses a risk not just to reputations, but to funding, peer acceptance, and career survival. In such a climate, radical findings are often shelved indefinitely, not for lack of merit, but for fear of disruption. The result is what researchers now call a shadow zone in American archaeology, a space where dozens of discoveries were neither validated nor fully discarded, but simply disappeared from scientific discourse. What remains are scattered journal fragments, incomplete ledgers, and the recollections of those who once glimpsed what is no longer accessible. Today, the Smithsonian remains a pillar of public trust, an institution of prestige, welcoming millions of visitors each year. But according to independent researchers, behind its polished displays lie storage rooms few will ever see and archives too controversial or inconvenient for release. Perhaps the real question isn't which version of history is true, but how. Many truths were excluded, quietly and permanently, because they didn't fit the narrative we were prepared to accept. And this culture of omission didn't stop with artifacts. As the 20th century progressed, another form of censorship emerged, one less tangible, but no less effective: the quiet disappearance of documentary films from national archives. Not due to age or damage, but because their content touched, too closely on historical truths that remained unresolved or politically inconvenient. From the earliest days of cinema, documentary film has played a vital role in preserving collective memory. Across the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union, state-sponsored crews captured footage of archaeological expeditions, scholarly debates, and interviews with first-hand witnesses to pivotal events. These films were often declared public assets, destined for permanent preservation. Yet, over the decades, select reels began to vanish, not because of degradation, but because they revealed what some deemed too disruptive for public view. One such film documented early excavations at Teotihuacan, Mexico, shot between 1917 and 1920. The footage included close-ups of murals and monolithic structures, revealing glyphs and carvings inconsistent with later Aztec influence. Some scholars believed the imagery suggested a much older culture, possibly with ties to both the Andes and Mesoamerica. Housed initially at the Library of Congress, the full film was labeled restricted in the 1950s, just as early dating hypotheses were being systematically dismissed as speculative. Though snippets resurfaced in later educational films, the complete reel was never made public. When Archaeology magazine requested access in 1973, they were told the film was under content review. That status has remained unchanged. In the UK, a similar fate befell a 1936 film titled The Hidden Mounds. Shot in Somerset, it documented ancient earthworks and burial sites. In one scene, archaeologists appear visibly stunned after uncovering Roman-style brickwork beneath layers dated to the Bronze Age. Initially screened in public forums through the 1940s, the film was quietly withdrawn in the 1960s during an archival audit. The official reason: unverified accuracy. Copies were recalled from regional libraries and placed into indefinite storage. Even in the post-war era age, marked by growing calls for transparency, numerous films were quietly labeled as containing sensitive material. Among them is footage from Nevada excavation sites showing stone tools found in strata far older than the Clovis boundary. The implications were clear. The evidence didn't match the accepted migration timeline. After limited test screenings, those films disappeared. Today, historians and archivists still debate how much of this was active suppression versus cautious gatekeeping, but the outcome is unchanged. We're left with gaps, missing links, not only in our archaeological record but also in the stories we tell about who we are and where we came from. In the end, the deeper issue may not be one of conspiracy, but of comfort. What happens when institutions become so invested in the consistency of the narrative that they quietly erase everything that questions it? Because when history is selectively preserved, the real loss isn't just of evidence, it's of possibility. Only fragments remain faded, stills tucked into aging research volumes. Most footage, once accessible to scholars, has quietly disappeared from the public domain. Some argue these removals stem not from deliberate tampering, but from institutional caution. In a media-driven world, a single out-of-context clip can ignite public controversy, eroding trust in academic authority. But critics contend that such justifications mask a deeper issue when only pre-approved narratives are shown. Silence itself becomes a fertile ground for conspiracy. To this day, National Archives still hold restricted film catalogues. The reasons cited vary from historical sensitivity and lack of scholarly consensus to concerns over individual reputations. Yet, among independent researchers, a consensus persists. Without transparency and open review, we may never fully grasp what these sealed reels contain or why they were hidden to begin with. And perhaps the greatest irony lies in this: we live in a digital age, an era defined by open data, crowdsourced knowledge, and instant access. Yet entire visual records remain locked, erased by time or disaster, but deliberately withheld. Not because they were lost, but because they were deemed inconvenient to the stories we've grown comfortable telling. Among these contentious artifacts, few have stirred as much enduring debate as the Piri Reis mappa, 500-year-old fragment of gazelle skin that challenges accepted narratives of post-medieval cartography. Drawn in 1513 by Ottoman admiral and geographer Piri Reis, the map was compiled using sources from sailors, traders, and European maps referred to in Ottoman texts as Frankish. Only 1/3 of the original survives, now preserved at Istanbul's Topkapi Palace. At first glance, it appears consistent with 16th century Portolan charts, ornate coastlines, sailing routes, and vivid annotations. But what has kept this document at the center of historical controversy is its southern portion, depiction of land extending far beyond South America, with a coastline strikingly similar to that of Antarctica. This poses a riddle, according to conventional history. Antarctica wasn't even discovered until 1820, yet the Piri Reis map not only acknowledges such a landmass, but also illustrates its coastal features with uncanny accuracy, particularly the curvature of Queen Maud Land, whose contours match modern satellite imagery. More provocatively, some researchers suggest that the map reflects a pre-glacial Antarctica, showing terrain currently buried beneath ice. This claim fuels the theory of ancient, unacknowledged cartographic knowledge, but mainstream academia has long approached such assertions with skepticism. Most institutions classify the southern features as artistic speculation, imaginative filler added by Renaissance cartographers when faced with unknown regions. This interpretation has shaped museum exhibits and textbooks, reducing the maps' anomalies to creative guesswork. Not all scholars were satisfied with that explanation. In the 1960s, historian Charles Hapgood became the most prominent figure, challenging the orthodox view. In his book, Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, he conducted a geodetic analysis of the Piri Reis map and proposed that its projections required knowledge of spherical trigonometry far beyond what was available in the early 1500s. He even enlisted support from the US Air Force, which reportedly confirmed that parts of the map resembled subglacial topography. Still, lacking archaeological corroboration, Hapgood's work was dismissed by the academic establishment. His ideas were too speculative and too vulnerable to hijacking by fringe theorists and Atlantis enthusiasts. Today, the Piri Reis map occupies an uneasy space, classified not as forbidden, but as misunderstood. It sits behind you, their protected glass in Istanbul, admired for its artistry, quietly stripped of its implications. Visitors gaze at its intricate coastline but leave with a tidy explanation. A beautiful artifact, but inaccurate. And perhaps that quiet dismissal says more than outright denial ever could. For sometimes, the most effective way to suppress a disruptive artifact is not to ban it, but to reduce it to aesthetic curiosity and let time bury the questions it raises. If the Piri Reis map whispers of forgotten knowledge, then the story of ancient Polynesian navigation speaks with thunderous clarity. It challenges not only historical timelines, but also the very framework of who we credit with global exploration. Long before European ships crossed the Pacific, Polynesians were traversing thousands of kilometers across open ocean in double-hulled voyaging, canoes voca without compasses, sextants, or written charts. Their navigation was encoded in oral tradition, passed down through chants, rituals, and training that taught how to read the stars, feel the shape of waves, interpret wind patterns, and track seabird migrations. When European explorers, Dutch, and later British arrived in Tahiti, Hawaii, and Aotearoa, New Zealand, they were stunned. James Cook himself recorded in his journals that Polynesians drew in the sand charts more intricate than any sea map we carried. What is rarely acknowledged is that early European expeditions studied these native routes meticulously, often copying them for their own use. In British, French, and Spanish naval archives, one can still find hand-drawn maps and annotated travelogues describing Polynesian anchorage points, prevailing winds, and ocean depths. Some records go even further. They note how European captains hired native wayfinders to guide their ships through difficult waters. One especially revealing example is a Polynesian sea route between Tahiti and New Zealand, recopied in Sydney in 1826 and now buried in the British Admiralty archives. This map includes not only island positions, but also annotations on oceanic phenomena, such as tilapa, a technique for detecting land by observing how light refracts through specific wave patterns. But by the mid-19th century, as European powers solidified imperial dominance, these indigenous maritime systems began to disappear from official records. Naval manuals stopped referencing native guides. Polynesian knowledge was no longer our source, but a threat to the myth that discovery was solely the triumph of Europe. What remains today are scattered fragments, forgotten maps, oral traditions, and the occasional museum plaque. But the deeper question lingers: have we narrowed the collective memory of seafaring to uphold a Eurocentric narrative of exploration? The Piri Reis map and the legacy of Polynesian navigation both suggest something profoundly inconvenient to conventional history. Long before satellites and steamships, There were navigators who understood the seas in ways we are only beginning to rediscover. Their stories were never truly lost, only hidden, sidelined, or quietly rebranded. Because, in the end, rewriting history rarely happens with fire. More often, it begins with silence. By the early 20th century, a peculiar shift had taken place in maritime documentation. One such case involved a navigational manuscript reclassified not as maritime data, but as mere ethnographic notes. Similarly, French naval manuals from the 1860s once featured detailed sea routes through the Tuamotu archipelago, Rapa Nui, and the Marquesas Islands routes that relied on Polynesian wind direction markers. But in later editions, this entire section vanished without explanation. Its contents survive now only through scattered references in the archives of the French National Library. Why were these ancient navigational routes removed? Some historians argue it was a byproduct of modernization. As European navies adopted magnetic compasses, sextants, and marine chronometers, oral navigation traditions were deemed obsolete. But researchers like David Lewis, author of We, the Navigators, disagree. He suggests these omissions reflect something deeper, a systemic dismissal of indigenous knowledge because it contradicted the myth of Europe as the sole discoverer and master of the world's oceans. That myth began to unravel in the 20th century. As post-colonial scholarship gained traction, Polynesian navigators started to reconstruct ancient sea routes not in theory, but through lived voyages. The most iconic of these was the 1976 journey of the Hokulea canoe, guided by Mo Pialeg, a Micronesian wayfinder sailing over 4,800 kilometers from Hawaii to Tahiti without a single modern instrument. Pialeg's success stunned the academic world and validated what had long been dismissed as mythic navigation. These skills were real, and they were astonishingly precise. Today, many of the hand-drawn indigenous maps, once relegated to folklore, are being digitized. But few people know that for over a century, they were considered authoritative navigational records until they were quietly erased from official histories to uphold the illusion of Western maritime supremacy. And this brings us to a sobering truth. When a civilization leaves no written records, its knowledge can be discredited with ease, no matter how vast or sophisticated it once was. A people could sail across entire oceans halfway around the planet yet be forgotten simply because their wisdom was preserved in oral traditions, not parchment. This marginalization of indigenous achievement finds a parallel in an even more controversial hypothesis, that African sailors may have reached the Americas long before Columbus. In the early 20th century, this idea was seriously explored. Scattered across Central and South America are perplexing signs, stone carvings with facial features unlike any known Mesoamerican type, copper artifacts of unfamiliar alloy composition, and ancient seed remains from species not native to the Americas. These fragments form a puzzle that refuses to fit neatly into the standard historical narrative. One of the first to investigate this was Harvard linguist Leo Wiener. In his 3-volume work, Africa and the Discovery of America, 1920 to 1922, he highlighted striking cultural parallels: cotton processing methods, banana cultivation techniques in Mexico and Peru, and linguistic echoes resembling Mand and Yoruba languages. He also noted ritual customs and visual motifs that aligned closely with West African traditions. Though critics dismissed his findings as coincidental, Wiener's work was, for a time, treated as legitimate scholarship. Then, in 1976, historian Ivan van Sertima reignited the debate where they came before Columbus. He proposed that the colossal Olmec stone heads, carved with broad noses and full lips, were stylized memories of contact with West African sailors, possibly from the Mali Empire in the 13th or 14th century. Van Sertima even cited Spanish colonial chronicles, including accounts by Vasco Núñez de Balboa, which mentioned dark-skinned peoples living along the Panamanian coast. But from that point on, institutional resistance surged. Critics pointed to a lack of definitive genetic or archaeological evidence. By the 1980s, this theory was all but erased from school textbooks. The Olmec heads were reclassified as wholly indigenous artifacts, and all alternative interpretations were sidelined as fringe speculation. Yet key anomalies remain unexplained. For example, Gossypium herbaceum, Old World cotton species, has been found in pre-Columbian archaeological layers. Botanists admit that transoceanic seed dispersal is theoretically possible, yet such evidence is left out of mainstream academic discourse due to lack of consensus. Even attempts to initiate dialogue have been muted. Panels proposing serious exploration of pre-Columbian African contact are often declined at major archaeological conferences, not due to lack of evidence, but to avoid political or racial controversy. The result? A chilling silence where open inquiry should be. Still, independent researchers such as Runako Rashidi and Clyde Winters continue to collect data. Though their work is rarely given a platform, the idea endures, not because of romanticism, but because it asks a transformative question. If Afrikaans crossed the Atlantic centuries before Columbus, does the narrative of the so-called Age of Discovery shift from conquest to something far more complex, a story of intercultural contact that predates empire? In the public sphere, this theory remains mostly absent. The Olmec heads stand on quiet display in museums, dated from 1200 to 400 BCE, with no clear explanation as to why their features diverge so drastically from other Mesoamerican sculpture. And herein lies the most difficult question of all. When a theory challenges the Eurocentric foundations of global history, is it ever truly evaluated on its merits, or simply erased because it dares to alter who we think arrived first? If these transoceanic journeys defy conventional history, then the ancient stonework of Pumapunku in Bolivia presents a different kind of enigma, one of engineering, not navigation. Perched on the windswept Altiplano, the Pumapunku complex of the larger Tiwanaku archaeological site is a marvel of prehistoric craftsmanship. Giant sandstone and diorite blocks, some weighing over 100 tons, are carved with astonishing precision. Mirror-smooth surfaces, laser-straight edges, and perfectly drilled holes suggest techniques far ahead of their time. The iconic H-shaped stones exhibit beveling so uniform and surfaces so flat that even modern stonemasons struggle to replicate them without advanced tools. The first major study came from Arthur Poznański in the early 20th century. Over 5 decades, he meticulously measured, mapped, and aligned the stones with celestial markers. His conclusion: that Pumapunku's construction may date back far earlier than previously assumed, possibly to a time long before the Inca and even the known Tiwanaku civilization. And that mystery still holds. Who built Pumapunku? How did they move such enormous blocks without wheeled transport, iron tools, or written language? And more disturbingly, why do so many modern scholars avoid asking these questions openly? Because, like Polynesian navigation and pre-Columbian African contact, the full story of Pumapunku may not fit the tidy linear script of Western historical progress. And when evidence disrupts the official timeline, history doesn't correct itself. It simply forgets. Pomapunku has long baffled scholars and engineers alike. In the early 20th century, Bolivian archaeologist Arthur Poznański proposed that the site could be over 15,000 years old, an assertion that drew immediate and fierce resistance from European academics. His detailed measurements and celestial alignments hinted at an age far older than conventional timelines allowed. But after his death, his manuscripts were fragmented, much of his research unpublished, and his conclusions quietly dismissed. In the 1950s, excavation teams from the US and Germany returned to the site. Radiocarbon dating of nearby agricultural layers yielded more conservative results, dating human activity to around 1,500 years ago. But while the dating of nearby soil layers was prioritized, the central mystery, the shaping and movement of Pomapunku's massive diorite blocks, was left untouched. No serious inquiry was made into the engineering techniques behind these impossibly smooth cuts, or the transport of stones weighing over 100 tons. By the close of the 20th century, despite the fact that the blocks remained exposed and undisturbed in plain sight, official archaeological activity at the site had largely ceased. No comprehensive laser scan survey has been undertaken. No engineering study commissioned. The tools exist. The site is accessible. So why the silence? Independent researchers like Christopher Dunn, along with geological teams, have examined the diorite and concluded that such precision would be virtually impossible. Using primitive tools, diorite, harder than iron, resists shaping with copper chisels and stone hammers. Yet formal research proposals into this enigma are routinely denied, allegedly due to a lack of theoretical framework. That phrase has become a shield behind which institutional caution hides. Academic funding, they argue, should favor sites with inscriptions, artifacts, or written records. But critics point out that this rationale rings hollow, especially when the raw mystery of Pomapunku lies not in buried ruins, but in fully exposed engineering. There are no plaques describing stone carving techniques, no diagrams, no museum panels outlining how these blocks were transported across the Andean highlands. Just a single sign, Pomapunku, circa 15th century CE, and that is all. In the rarefied air of the Bolivian plateau, the blocks remain unmoved, massive and eerily precise, not supernatural perhaps, but undeniably beyond the skill set of any civilization officially linked to the site. When excavations are indefinitely postponed, and modern technology is withheld from one of the most anomalous sites in the world, silence begins to resemble a kind of soft censorship, quiet, unspoken, yet highly effective. The true power of Pomapunku may not be in the stones themselves, but in what they expose, the willingness of archaeology to look away when faced with questions it cannot answer without rewriting history. And while Pomapunku challenges our understanding of ancient technology, the colossal heads of the Olmec civilization challenge something even more delicate: the narrative of ethnic isolation in the ancient Americas. Emerging around 1500 BCE on the Gulf Coast of Mexico, the Olmec are widely recognized as Mesoamerica's mother culture. They pioneered temple pyramids and a rudimentary writing system, and left behind some of the most iconic artifacts in pre-Columbian history. 17 massive stone heads, each weighing between 20 and 50 tons. Their defining features, broad noses, full lips, and low cheekbones, have sparked debate since the 19th century. In 1938, archaeologist Matthew Stirling led a major excavation at sites like La Venta and San Lorenzo. He openly remarked on the head's unusual morphology. noting their distinct differences from typical Mesoamerican art. To some, these features bore a striking resemblance to West African facial traits. Sterling, cautious and bound by the politics of his era, stopped short of drawing any conclusions. But by the 1970s, amid a global wave of civil rights consciousness, African-descended scholars like Ivan van Sertima revisited these questions. His landmark 1976 book, They Came Before Columbus, presented comparative facial analysis, citing Spanish colonial records describing dark-skinned people along the Central American coast. He proposed the possibility of early transatlantic contact, suggesting that manned herb merchants or West African sailors may have reached the Americas long before Columbus. The response was swift and overwhelmingly hostile. By the 1980s, mainstream institutions moved quickly to reframe the Olmec heads in textbooks and museums. Earlier suggestions of African influence were replaced by interpretations emphasizing stylized aesthetics. The prevailing view now held that the heads portrayed idealized local rulers, and their features, once seen as anomalous, were rebranded as symbolic of power, not ethnicity. This reinterpretation has merit. DNA evidence does not currently support an African origin for the Olmec. Morphological comparisons, critics argue, can oversimplify complex ethnic narratives. But for many independent researchers, the core issue is not who's right but why the discussion itself was shut down. Rather than confront difficult possibilities, academic institutions often choose erasure. A stark example came in 1990, when Tulane University planned a scholarly panel titled Morphological Elements and the Possibility of Transoceanic Contact. Just months before the event, the panel was cancelled. Organizers cited a desire to avoid racially charged controversy. Since then, the topic has largely vanished from academic conferences, journals, and university curricula. In Mexico, the national archaeological authorities remain cautious. While some local scholars privately acknowledge the head's unusual features, their public statements tend to frame them in vague, neutral terms, such as representing an elite artistic tradition. The deeper implications are left untouched, and so the question lingers. If there was no contact with Africa, why do the Olmec heads bear features that so sharply diverge from regional artistic norms? Independent researchers continue to speculate, some citing foreign merchants or shared cultural symbology. But such ideas are rarely allowed into mainstream discourse. Historians suggest that this silence may not stem from conspiracy, but from a kind of post-colonial paralysis. In a world still struggling with racial equity and historical injustice, scholars fear misinterpretation. No one wants to be associated with pseudo-historians, white supremacists, or politically charged Pan-Africanism, and so they stay silent. But silence, when institutionalized, becomes a danger all its own. When open inquiry is sacrificed to avoid discomfort, history doesn't become safer, becomes less truthful. And in that silence, the voices of those who shaped the stones, stone sand perhaps sailed unknown seas, are buried deeper than any artifact ever could be. Whatever the truth may be, it often becomes fertile ground for myth, speculation, and deep cultural polarization. Today, visitors stand silently before the Olmec head's massive stone visages, staring into the distant horizon with solemn, readable expressions. The museum plaque is minimal. Mech head, circa 900 BCE, distinct artistic style. No further comment, no deeper context, and maybe that's the most unsettling question of all. If a civilization truly was more sophisticated and more interconnected than our approved histories permit, Are we ready to accept that cultural identity was never simply defined by skin color or modern borders? Or do we cling to the version of history that feels safer, easier to digest? If the mech-heads unsettled archaeologists with their unfamiliar features, then the story of certain ancient Chinese world maps threatens to overturn even more. These maps suggest that geographical knowledge in pre-modern China may have far outpaced what Western history credits sound, that this knowledge was deliberately hidden. Among the most debated is the Qianlong Quangyu II, or the Qianlong Global Map, a hand-painted silk scroll believed to have been completed during the early Qing dynasty, likely around 1763. Preserved in imperial archives, it depicts Asia, Europe, and Africa with surprising precision, but its real controversy lies in its portrayal of the Americas and the Pacific Islands. The annotations speak of lands resembling Polynesia, even New Zealand. America is labeled Da Shizhou, the Great Western Continent, and the southern polar region is marked as White Lands, a place of eternal snow, inaccessible by ship. These aren't singular anomalies. Other maps, like the Haiwaiwa II overseas, country's map circulated quietly among Qing scholars and diplomatic circles. Some Western scholars in the 19th century dismissed these maps as Jesuitins products of European knowledge smuggled into China during the Ming era. But troubling inconsistencies remained. Notably, while European maps of the same period still entertained the idea of California as an island, the Qianlong map clearly presents a continuous western coastline of the Americas. This suggests either access to alternative houses or knowledge that predated European assumptions. Modern Chinese researchers, such as Professor Lu Xin, have proposed that these maps were compiled using a synthesis of Arab maritime charts, Ming Dynasty navigator accounts, and merchant folklore gathered over centuries. Others view them more cautiously, interpreting the maps as symbolic political statements designed to reinforce the Qing court's vision of a world under its philosophical umbrella. Regardless of their origin, one fact is indisputable. By the late 18th century, the Qing imperial court ordered these maps sealed. They were labeled imperial property, their reproduction forbidden. According to the Qing veritable records, Qing Shilu, a 1790 edict instructed the Ministry of Rights to catalogue and restrict access to over 200 sensitive maps, citing fears of foreign and frontier data leaking beyond court control. When the Qing dynasty collapsed, many of these maps were lost, stolen, or damaged. A few scrolls surfaced in early 20th century auctions, sold discreetly to collectors in Europe and Japan. Due to fragmented archival references, scholars today cannot confirm whether these maps were drawn from first-hand observation or woven from layers of speculation and regional lore, but the timing of their suppression is telling. As European powers expanded their maritime dominance, these Chinese maps vanished from academic discussion. In global education, Chinese geography was quietly repositioned, portrayed as insular and landlocked. Meanwhile, Columbus, Magellan, and Mercator became the icons of global discovery. Only in the late 20th century did voices like Gavin, Menzies, controversial yet persistent, revive public interest in the idea that Chinese navigators may have reached distant shores long before Europe's age of exploration. While many historians reject Menzies' bolder claims, they agree on one critical point. The Qing state's deliberate censorship of these maps reveals an anxiety of fear that such information, if misinterpreted or weaponized, could undermine imperial authority. Today, fragments of those ancient scrolls still exist, deep within the archives of the Forbidden City. They are rarely digitized and rarely studied. Visitors who inquire are politely told, these are imperial court documents, not representative of official geographic knowledge. And perhaps the most difficult question isn't whether these maps were accurate. It's who decides which version of the world deserves to be remembered. When knowledge is sealed away for the sake of convenience or power, history becomes easier to package and easier to believe. If the Qing dynasty's suppression of global cartography reflected a fear of uncontrolled knowledge, then the modern world has inherited a subtler but no less effective method of control: academic gatekeeping. Not through overt censorship, but through the quiet shaping of what research is allowed to exist. This is the architecture of modern intellectual boundaries, where influence resides not just in the evidence itself, but in who gets funding, who gets published, and who is deemed credible by the institutions of higher learning. At first glance, academia seems like an open arena governed by merit. But beneath the surface lies a curated ecosystem, from peer review boards to research grants. Influence flows through invisible channels, and those who step too far from accepted paradigms are quickly sidelined. Major funders, ranging from the Rockefeller and Ford Foundations to the US Social Science Research Council, prioritize research that aligns with prevailing theories. The phrase mainstream scientific direction appears neutral, even logical, but in practice, it excludes inquiries into advanced prehistoric civilizations or transoceanic contact before Columbus. Researchers proposing such ideas are often denied funding outright. The result is a quiet paradox. Those bold enough to ask unconventional questions must self-fund and then are dismissed for lacking institutional support. It's a loop that ensures conformity while masquerading as academic rigor. In a 1998 interview, archaeologist John Anthony West said bluntly, "We don't lack evidence. We lack an academic system brave enough to publish it." This soft censorship isn't limited to funding. It thrives in editorial rooms, where journal gatekeepers decide what reaches the public. In 2002, Antiquity Journal was accused of suppressing new dating studies from Tiwanaku and Pomapunka studies that might have challenged long-settled chronologies. One anonymous editor admitted, "We didn't want to reopen a debate the field worked hard to put to rest 50 years ago." Even university curricula are curated in this way. Boards decide what gets taught, what's omitted, and what's quietly labeled as fringe. In this way, the boundaries of acceptable knowledge are policed not with chains, but with silence. And that may be the most effective censorship of all, the one where no one notices it's happening. In 2010, a group of faculty at a prominent US university proposed introducing a seminar on pre-Columbian transoceanic contact. The course never materialized. It was vetoed by the academic board, not for lack of interest, but due to what they cited as insufficient scholarly consensus. This wasn't an isolated case. It represents a broader pattern. While many such decisions arise from legitimate academic caution, intended to guard against pseudoscience infiltrating the classroom, they also reveal a deeper, more troubling dynamic. The line between intellectual rigor and institutional suppression is often razor thin. Some historians frame this dynamic as a form of academic self-defense, necessary gatekeeping to preserve credibility. Others are more direct. They describe it as an unspoken guild system, a self-reinforcing network where professors train protégés, who then become colleagues and gatekeepers themselves, all preserving the same accepted boundaries. Step outside those lines, no matter how compelling your data or how sincere your inquiry, and the consequences are swift. Loss of funding, publication rejections, and exclusion from curricula. The term fringe becomes both a label and a sentence. Attend a major archaeology confrontation, and you might be struck by what appears to be an atmosphere of openness. But look closer. Certain questions are conspicuously absent. You'll find no rigorous panel discussions on the diorite stonework of Pomapunku, no serious treatment of pre-Columbian Trans-Pacific exchange, and no debate over the implications of the Piri race map. Not because these ideas have been conclusively disproven, because they no longer fit within the framework the modern academic world has chosen to preserve. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is not that some clandestine cabal is pulling the strings, but that no such conspiracy is required. An implicit consensus has emerged, a silent agreement that certain questions should never be asked, and certain truths must remain unspoken. Historically, academic gatekeeping operated through overt means control over funding, peer-reviewed journals, and university positions. But in the digital age, a new, quieter form of censorship has evolved. It's not built on bans. It's built on algorithms, content rankings, and opaque editorial systems that invisibly shape what the public is allowed to see when they search for knowledge. Platforms like Google, Scholar, Wikipedia, and open access repositories are often viewed as neutral democratic spaces. But beneath the surface, they enforce strict editorial hierarchies. Take Wikipedia, for instance. With over 6 million English-language articles, it proudly promotes its neutral point of view policy. Yet, articles flagged as controversial topics, like the Piri race map, pre-Columbian contact theories, or lost civilizations, are often locked from public editing. Control is handed over to a small circle of senior administrators and trusted editors. These individuals have sweeping authority to delete citations, add warning labels, suppress references, and restructure content to reflect only the dominant view. In a 2017 interview, a former Wikipedia senior editor, identified only as JM, admitted, "There are articles we deliberately structure with bias, not because the information is wrong, but because we don't want Wikipedia associated with conspiracy theory culture." Google Scholar, the world's largest academic search engine, uses algorithms designed to favor articles from prestigious journals and those with high citation counts. On paper, that may seem like a neutral metric. In practice, it means that research, especially if published in independent or newer journals, gets buried. One 2015 study conducted at the University of North Carolina explored this firsthand. When researchers searched for academic papers on pre-Columbian African contact with the Americas, only 2 out of the top 100 results seriously considered the idea. More than 50 original articles published in lesser-known journals or conference proceedings were completely absent from the search results. Then there's content steering. Type Pomapunku advanced stonework into Google, and you're immediately prompted with suggestions like Pomapunku, debunked or ancient. Aliens hoax. The implication is subtle but unmistakable. Curiosity in this area is irrational, and your inquiry is illegitimate. Even well-meaning platforms like academia.edu and S-Research get lauded for democratizing scholarly access, employ hidden filters. While users may upload papers freely, those tagged with terms like pseudoarchaeology or fringe theory are quietly deranged, removed from discovery feeds, and sometimes deleted entirely after being reported for vague violations of academic integrity, often without peer review or transparency. To be fair, These mechanisms stem in part from a legitimate concern: the spread of misinformation. The digital age has made it easier than ever for poorly sourced claims to gain traction. But the danger lies not just in falsehoods, but in who gets to decide what counts as false. When editorial boards, administrators, and machine learning engineers determine which questions deserve visibility, we are no longer protecting truth, we are curating reality. Many younger scholars argue that genuine intellectual freedom must include uncomfortable hypotheses, so long as they are anchored in data, subjected to critique, and open to debate. But instead of engaging these questions, most platforms opt for the quieter path: warning labels, content suppression, an algorithmic burial that relegates controversial findings to the digital abyss of page 10 where few ever look. The question, then, is not whether these platforms are hiding everything. It's whether they are shaping our collective perception so thoroughly that we no longer realize which pieces of the puzzle are missing. If today's digital censorship is subtle, algorithmic, and abstract, then during the Cold War, a more calculated mechanism was already at work, one rooted not in code, but in geopolitics. After World War II, as the United States and the Soviet Union expanded their global influence, archaeology became an unlikely but potent tool of statecraft. Under the guise of academic research, expeditions were deployed into sensitive regions. Their stated mission to uncover humanity's past, their hidden mandate to gather intelligence. One declassified case, Project Mallory, stands out. Operating from the late 1940s through the 1960s, it presented itself as a prehistoric cultural survey across Central Asia. In reality, it was a CIA-backed initiative that embedded operatives into archaeological teams traveling through the Pamir Mountains, northern Afghanistan, and other strategically crucial areas. Publicly, these expeditions focused on Bronze Age settlements and ancient trade routes. Privately, they were collecting satellite calibration data, conducting soil analyses for future airfields, and mapping terrain for potential military use. In short, archaeology wasn't just about the past. It became a tool to navigate the power struggles of the present. And that's the paradox we now face. The tools meant to illuminate history field research, academic institutions, digital platforms, are often the very structures that conceal or filter it, not because they are always malicious, but because they are vulnerable to pressure, bias, and fear of reputational risk. Whether it's an editorial lock on Wikipedia or an intelligence operative disguised as a scholar, the effect is the same: silence. We tell ourselves that knowledge is more accessible than ever, but when uncomfortable truths are quietly filtered, when algorithms steer our curiosity into pre-approved corridors, and when brave voices are pushed into the margins, one has to ask, who gets to decide what humanity remembers and what it forgets? In the Soviet Union, archaeology was never just about unearthing the past. It was a geopolitical instrument. During the 1950s, state-backed expeditions to Central Asia and Mongolia, directed by the Soviet Academy of Sciences, were as much about affirming Russian dominance as they were about academic discovery. These digs were used to argue that these regions naturally belonged within a broader Russian civilizational zone. Behind the excavation sites, a quieter motive lurked. Research often doubled as intelligence gathering, profiling local communities under the guise of scholarship. But the entanglement between archaeology and state power didn't stop there. Across the Middle East, in Iran, Iraq, and Syria, Western archaeological teams, particularly from the US and UK, were frequently supported by covert funding, excavations at Sumerian sites in 1950s Iraq, officially sponsored by cultural institutes, were later shown to have received up to 60% of their budget from the US, State Department, and the CIA. The stated goal was to preserve Mesopotamian heritage. The unstated one, monitor and influence emerging political factions aligned with the Soviet bloc. Ironically, this covert patronage sometimes produced unintended benefits. The influx of resources led to the preservation of sites that may otherwise have vanished. But there was always a cost. Findings that challenged sanctioned narratives, chronologies that didn't align, structures that hinted at timelines far older than permitted, were quietly shelved, redacted, or never released at all. One such case was Kalokha Darband in northern Iraq. Early architectural data suggested pre-Sumerian occupation, potentially pushing back Mesopotamian timelines. But the data was classified under the vague rationale of military sensitivity. Decades later, the full site report remains unpublished. When the Cold War ended, some scholars began to speak openly. At a 1996 symposium, historian Peter de Manuelian issued a stark warning. Sometimes, when we look at a photograph of an excavation, we're also looking at a political message. It's a haunting observation and a necessary one. From 1945 to 1975, hundreds of archaeological files remained sealed in the archives of the CIA, MI6, and the Soviet GRU. Independent researchers who request access are met with polite refusals. No relevant records found. But perhaps the most dangerous legacy of this entanglement is not surveillance or secrecy its precedent. When archaeology becomes a servant of statecraft, the boundary between discovery and propaganda dissolves. Truth bends, and the historical record, once thought to be a bedrock of civilization, becomes a hall of mirrors. We've followed this pattern across centuries. Libraries burned not just to destroy scrolls, but to erase identities. Maps were withheld not for safety, but to preserve dominance. Expeditions vanished, not by accident, but by design. History is not a monument. It is a river carved by power, ambition, and fury, rooted again and again by those who control the flow of information. When an empire burns its books, it does not simply reduce parchment to ash. It incinerates memory. When a university silences a paper because its findings are too controversial, it builds a wall not of caution, but of obedience. When digital platforms mark inconvenient ideas as conspiracy before they are even discussed, they silently crown themselves the new gatekeepers of memory. And perhaps the most dangerous erosion is not in forgetting, but in the slow rewriting of history, layer by layer, word by word, until what remains is no longer a record, but an echo. We've seen the evidence. Olmec stone heads with facial features, foreign to known Mesoamerican types dismissed as stylization, ancient world maps showing Antarctic coastlines centuries before European discovery sealed away in museum basements, black and white excavation reels locked in archive vaults labeled sensitive content, hidden from public scrutiny. Inner circles in academic and intelligence communities quietly deciding what gets published, what gets funded, and what gets forgotten. So we must ask the most uncomfortable question of all. Is the history we are taught grounded in evidence or in consensus? Not every theory is true, not every doubt is valid, but not every challenge is dangerous either, because it is often the disruptive question, the inconvenient observation, that keeps history alive, not as a museum relic, but as a living dialogue. The greatest secrets of the past may not lie buried in the Vatican archives, or sealed in a Cold War bunker, or inscribed in some forgotten scroll. They lie within us and our willingness to question, toin, investigate, and to challenge what we've been told to accept. Who decides what story gets preserved? Who holds the pen when the past is rewritten? And what version of that past will the next generation be taught to trust? If there's anything truly worth protecting, it isn't just relics or ruins. It's the courage to keep asking, even when the question makes the powerful uncomfortable, because history is not dead. It lives in every contradiction, every suppressed finding, every person willing to say, "I don't know if this is true, but I want to examine it." If this journey has stirred something in you, consider subscribing to the channel so you won't miss what's next. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Who do you think writes history? And who decides what version we're allowed to remember? Share this with others, because the past belongs to those who question it, and the future to those brave enough to listen. If you believe history holds more secrets than we're told, then you're in the right place. Subscribe to Secret Historian, where the forgotten past comes alive.